Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, what if the first people to shape North America were not the tribes most history books talk about? Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, and even before many of the cultures we know today had emerged, a mysterious civilization may have built massive earthworks, complex trade networks, and monuments so vast they can still be seen from the sky. Who are these forgotten builders? Where do they come from? And why did their story almost vanish from history? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more relaxing stories. Now start the story. Tonight, as we journey into the distant past, we'll explore one of America's most intriguing mysteries, the lost civilization that existed before Native America as we know it, and the clues they left behind in silence. There exists a certain corner of this land where the very soil prefers to hold its mysteries close. These are not the sort of riddles that academics dissect at conferences, nor the kind that get tucked away in the forgotten appendices of dusty volumes. These are far more ancient, far more substantial. These are secrets that were placed into the earth with intention, buried beneath a silence so profound that even those who actively search for them could stand directly above them, utterly unaware of the profound history beneath their feet. When the initial waves of European settlers journeyed inward from the Atlantic coastline, they were not stepping into a void. They were stepping into the lingering echo of a great event. They could sense it, a palpable presence they lacked the language to describe. The waterways followed peculiar paths. The woodlands bore the unmistakable mark of absent hands. The earth in particular valleys possessed a hue and a richness that defied natural explanation, arranged with an order that seemed far too deliberate for any untamed terrain. And then the discoveries began. Earthen embankments that extended for vast distances. Earthen pyramids that surpassed the height of any structure they had ever constructed in their homelands. Carefully planned geometric figures, laid out with a level of exactness that rendered their most skilled architects speechless. The patterns of walls, ditches, and raised pathways were so methodical, so mathematically sound, that the early observers did not fill their letters home with tales of awe. They filled them with a sense of dread. This is the element that historical records tend to omit, the palpable unease. These were not individuals given to irrational fears by the standards of their era. They were cartographers, combatants, traders, and theologians. They were people who placed their faith in logic and documentation. They had traversed an ocean because they believed they possessed a firm grasp of the world's workings. And then they found themselves confronted by something that resisted all their preconceived boxes. Something ancient, something immense, something that had endured for so long and been constructed with such meticulous care that it made their own society appear fleeting and insignificant. If you have chosen this narrative to guide you into slumber, that is precisely the purpose behind these creations. Perhaps you might consider subscribing and sharing a thought about your current location and the hour. I always take the time to peruse the comments, and there's a certain magic in knowing that someone in a distant Australian state, or the American Midwest, or the rugged Scottish Highlands is resting in the dark, absorbing the very same tale at this shared moment. All of us bound by a slender thread of wonderment for those who walked this earth before us. Because that is the central theme. Who were the predecessors? Not merely those who arrived before the colonizers, a question often debated for political purposes that often stray far from factual history. Not simply those who came before the indigenous groups the colonists first met, though that question is itself rich with complexity. This is about a period far older than any of that, an era that precedes the spoken memories of the people present when the Europeans arrived. a time so distant that even those whose lineage stretched back countless generations, whose ancestors' ancestors had watched the world change, even they regarded certain of these monuments and confessed they could not name their creators. That realization should give you pause. Consider its implications. A people who had inhabited a landmass for 10 millennia or more, who carried in their most ancient tales the memory of immense ice sheets, who knew the paths of rivers that had shifted course before any outsider ever set foot on the shore. Those same people, standing before specific mounds and embankments, would speak with a quiet, measured tone, as if selecting words to ward off misfortune. We did not construct these. This declaration, echoed by scores of distinct cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of interaction with newcomers, marks the true starting point of this narrative. Not the version we were presented with, not the one depicting simple folk living in perfect balance until sophisticated voyagers arrived from beyond the sea. The true story, the one lying beneath the surface narrative, the one that becomes progressively more bewildering and meticulously documented with each passing decade of archaeological endeavor. This is that account. It begins, as the most genuine truths often do, not with a singular revelation, but with a collection of minor contradictions that eventually become impossible to dismiss. A copper implement unearthed from a depth indicating an age of 4,000 years. Yet crafted using a technique requiring a knowledge of metallurgy that experts believed did not exist in North America during that epoch. A sequence of earthen ramparts enclosing a territory exceeding that of any Roman metropolis, designed with an astronomical precision that modern surveyors with satellite technology cannot surpass. A web of roads, actual paved pathways, stretching for hundreds of miles through what was assumed to be unspoiled wilderness. Exotic goods discovered in burial sites 1,000 miles from their points of origin, in quantities suggesting not sporadic exchange, but a structured, continent-spanning commercial enterprise. And beneath all of this, something even more perplexing: evidence of deliberate design. Not the simple organization any group employs to erect a shelter or dig a well, but a structured, multi-generational, continent-wide planning that demands a level of social complexity, political synchronization, and scientific acumen that no researcher, even the most generous, thought North America possessed prior to the arrival of Europeans. Someone orchestrated all of this. Someone selected these locations with a clear and deliberate purpose. Someone designed these orientations with tools we have yet to discover. Someone marshaled effort across distances that would tax contemporary logistics. Someone possessed knowledge, specific, applicable knowledge concerning astronomy, construction, cultivation, and long-range commerce that we are only now beginning to grasp. And then they were no more. Not gradually, not in the slow fading characteristic of most societies. The way Rome diminished over centuries, affording ample opportunity for observation and documentation. The fate that befell the people who constructed these marvels occurred with a swiftness and finality that is itself a profound riddle. The mounds were forsaken. The roads surrendered to the encroaching forest. The commercial relationships fractured. The wisdom accumulated over hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years vanished from the physical record so absolutely that those inhabiting the same terrain a few generations later genuinely did not recognize the purpose of the structures surrounding them, nor who had raised them. That is not the typical trajectory of decline. That is the signature of calamity. And the nature of that calamity remains one of the most disquieting and least examined questions in the entire sphere of American archaeology. Because the potential explanations lead toward a collision between what the physical evidence indicates and what the standard account permits. They point toward the probability that North American antiquity is not the straightforward chronicle taught in schools and repeated in documentaries. They point toward a reality more layered, more ancient, and more profoundly human than any of the comfortable tales we construct about this continent. Let us rewind to the commencement, not the start of European contact, nor even the genesis of the societies the first colonists encountered, but the beginning that the evidence genuinely supports. Roughly 15,000 years ago, the last glacial epoch was easing its hold on North America. The colossal ice sheets that had blanketed much of the land mass were withdrawing northward, leaving behind a landscape that had been carved and reshaped. The terrain was pristine. The soil was fresh. The waterways were following courses etched by the ice itself. And into this emerging world, or rather a world that was new in some respects and profoundly ancient in others, people were migrating. The precise route of their arrival is an ever-evolving story. The established model, the one most of us learned, described a trek across a land bridge from Asia during the glacial period, following herds of large mammals, dispersing southward through a gap between the ice sheets, gradually populating a continent untouched by human presence. That model is not entirely inaccurate, but it is becoming increasingly apparent that it is an oversimplification. The genetic data, the material evidence, and the spoken histories of numerous distinct indigenous groups all suggest a more intricate picture. Multiple waves of travel, different pathways, different eras. The possibility that people were present on this continent, crafting tools and leaving markers, far earlier than the textbook dates permit. There are locations across the Americas with dates that defy the standard chronology. A site in Chile showing human occupation going back 15,000 years, a period earlier than the ice-free corridor could have facilitated. Sites in Brazil containing cave paintings that some researchers date to 30,000 years before the present. Genetic lineages in certain South American groups that diverge from Asian populations far earlier than the land bridge timeline suggests. The evidence is fiercely debated, as is the case with the most crucial findings, but the general direction is consistent. Humanity has been present in the Americas for an immense span of time, long enough that the narrative of who they were and what they constructed is far more intricate than we have permitted ourselves to believe. And somewhere within that deep antiquity, something remarkable unfolded, not in a single place, nor at a single moment, but across the eastern portion of North America, in the river valleys, the highlands, and the loch shores of what is now the United States. People began to organize themselves in ways that extended far beyond the necessities of a simple band of hunter-gatherers. They began to build. The first aspect to comprehend regarding the earthworks of eastern North America is their magnitude, not the size of any individual structure, though some of those are impressive enough on their own. The scale of the entire undertaking. We are discussing tens of thousands of mounds, enclosures, earthworks, and geometric patterns spread across hundreds of thousands of square miles of land, constructed over a period of several thousand years, representing a cumulative investment of labor that archaeologists have estimated in the hundreds of millions of person-hours. Hundreds of millions. This is not the output of scattered nomadic bands, occasionally pausing to heap up some dirt. This is the work of a civilization with a sufficient population to generate that kind of surplus effort, enough structure to direct it, enough knowledge to plan it, enough continuity across generations to sustain it over the centuries required to complete it. The earliest of these earthworks date back approximately 5,000 years. That places them in the same general era as the earliest pyramids in Egypt, the first cities in Mesopotamia, the dawn of what we term the Bronze Age in the Old World. An interesting coincidence, if it is a coincidence, because the cultures constructing earthworks in North America at that time were not, by any definition we currently employ, civilizations in the same sense as Egypt or Mesopotamia. They possessed no writing system that we have been able to identify, no bronze, no wheel, no monumental stone architecture. Yet they were accomplishing feats that demand precisely the kind of organizational capability we associate with complex societies. They were building Watson Break. Watson Break is a site in northern Louisiana that remains largely unknown. It consists of 11 mounds connected by ridges, arranged in an oval pattern roughly 1,000 feet across, constructed by people we refer to as the archaic period peoples of North America. People who, according to every other line of evidence we possess, lived as hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no permanent villages, no social hierarchy that leaves obvious traces in the material record. Yet they organized themselves repeatedly, over a period of at least 500 years, to construct an earthen monument that required an extraordinary degree of coordination. 5 centuries of sustained, coordinated effort by people who were not supposed to have the social framework to sustain it. Watson Break is not an isolated case. The archaic period earthworks of Louisiana, the Poverty Point Complex, the various mound groups scattered across the region, they all convey the same message. People who were not expected to have complex societies were performing actions that required complex societies. The contradiction between our assumed understanding of these cultures and what their constructions demonstrate has been present in archaeological literature for decades, generating research papers, conferences, and carefully worded arguments without ever quite making its way into the story told to the public. Because the public narrative is simpler, and simpler is easier. And easier is what receives funding, publication, and inclusion in textbooks. But the evidence does not concern itself with convenience. Poverty Point deserves a closer look, because it is one of those locations where the disparity between what the evidence indicates and what the standard account allows becomes so pronounced that you can almost feel the pressure of trying to reconcile them. Situated in northeastern Louisiana, it dates to roughly 1700 BCE, making it contemporary with the peak of Egyptian civilization and the early development of Greek culture in the Aegean, and it is by any objective measure extraordinary. The central feature of Poverty Point is a series of 6 concentric ridges, each one a raised earthen embankment running in a partial arc around a central plaza. The ridges are arranged with a precision that could only have been achieved through deliberate planning and careful measurement. The outermost ridge has a diameter of nearly 2,000 feet. The entire complex covers more than 3 square miles. And at the heart of it all, a massive mound rises nearly 70 feet above the surrounding landscape. 70 feet. That is not a natural hill. That is an architectural declaration. But the mounds and ridges are only the most visible aspect of what was occurring at Poverty Point. The excavations conducted there over decades have revealed something even more remarkable. Evidence of long-distance trade at a scale that should have been impossible for any culture at this stage of development. Copper from the Great Lakes region, more than 1,000 miles to the north. Stones from the Ozarks, hundreds of miles to the west. Galena, a lead mineral used for ornamentation, from sources as distant as Illinois. Finished objects, tools, ornaments, and ritual items flowing into this site from an enormous geographical area. This was not casual bartering. This was commerce, structured, systematic, long-range commerce operating across a network that covered much of eastern North America, centered on a site that, by the standards we apply to such matters, should not have been capable of organizing anything more complex than a communal hunt. Someone needs to account for how a culture with no agriculture, no permanent settlements, and no discernible social hierarchy, was managing what amounts to an intercontinental trading empire. The explanations offered have been, to put it mildly, not entirely convincing. Perhaps the site was a ceremonial gathering place that attracted traders from a wide area. Perhaps the exchange was gift-giving between social equals rather than organized commerce. Perhaps the complexity we observe is the result of occasional meetings rather than permanent organization. Possibly, but the volume and consistency of the materials suggest something more systematic than any of those explanations fully addresses. And the precision of the earthworks, the deliberate geometry of those concentric ridges, demands exactly the kind of sustained, coordinated, knowledgeable effort that we associate with permanent organizational structures. Something was present, something we have not yet adequately named. And then, as if to highlight the peculiarity of all, Poverty Point was abandoned. Around 700 BCE, the site was largely depopulated, the trade networks collapsed, and the extraordinary experiment in large-scale organization that had been running for 1,000 years simply ceased. The mounds were left standing, empty monuments to whatever had been occurring there, as the forest gradually reclaimed the surrounding landscape. Why, we do not know. A climate shift, perhaps a catastrophic flood, internal social collapse, external pressure from other groups. The archaeology provides the fact of the abandonment, but not the reason. And that silence, that absence of explanation, is itself part of the mystery, because it happened again. Not immediately and not in the same location. But a few centuries after Poverty Point went quiet, a new tradition of mound building emerged in the Ohio River Valley. And it was different from anything that had come before. More organized, more geographically widespread, more architecturally sophisticated in certain ways that matter greatly when you begin asking questions about the kind of knowledge its builders possessed. This tradition is called Adena, and it marks the beginning of what archaeologists group together as the woodland period of eastern North American prehistory. The Adena people constructed burial mounds, sometimes modest, occasionally reaching impressive heights, scattered across what is now Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. They had clear mortuary practices, meaning they were interring their dead in ways that reveal beliefs about the afterlife, about social hierarchy, about the significance of particular individuals and lineages. They had craft specialization, with objects found in their mounds requiring levels of skill in working copper and mica and other materials that could only have been achieved through dedicated practice. And they had, or so the evidence suggests, some form of leadership structure capable of organizing the labor needed to build their mounds and maintain their burial traditions over several centuries. But the Adena are only the prelude, because what followed them, roughly 2,000 years ago, was something so far beyond what came before that archaeologists have been struggling to explain it ever since. The Hopewell tradition. If you wish to understand why certain researchers use words like civilization when describing pre-Columbian North America, and why other researchers become very uncomfortable when those words are used, Hopewell is the place to start. Because Hopewell is, by almost any measure you wish to apply, the thing that the accepted story of North American prehistory does not have room for. The Hopewell tradition is not a single culture in the way we typically mean that word. It is not a single group of people living in a single place with a single language and a single set of customs. It is a phenomenon, a set of shared practices, artistic styles, material goods, and possibly beliefs that spread across an enormous geographical area and was maintained over several centuries with a consistency that requires some kind of ongoing coordination to explain. At its peak, roughly 100 to 500 CE, the Hopewell interaction sphere, as archaeologists call it, encompassed most of eastern North America. trade goods and artistic styles found in Ohio, which appears to have been a central node of the network, also appear in sites from Florida to Minnesota, from the Atlantic coast to Kansas. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region of Wyoming appears in Ohio burial mounds. Copper from the Great Lakes is worked into objects that appear across the continent. Mica from the southern Appalachians is cut into geometric and animal shapes that mirror each other across hundreds of miles. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico appear alongside Lake Superior copper, alongside Rocky Mountain grizzly bear teeth, alongside Pacific Ocean shark teeth, all in the same burial complex, all in the same river valley in southern Ohio. That is not simple exchange. That is a network. A continent-wide network of exchange and communication and presumably social relationship, operating at a level of complexity that we do not have adequate language for, because we do not have a category for it in our mental model of pre-Columbian North America. In the earthworks are where Hopewell stops being a puzzle and starts being something that forces a fundamental rethinking of what we thought we knew. The Newark earthworks in central Ohio cover 4 square miles of land. 4 square miles of geometric earthen architecture, connected by walls and causeways, aligned to astronomical events, laid out with a mathematical precision that was not fully appreciated until modern surveying equipment was brought to bear on it. There are perfect circles, perfect octagons, perfect squares, and not just individually perfect, but geometrically related to each other in ways that suggest a unified design created from a single plan. The Great Circle at Newark, one component of the complex, encloses an area large enough to contain 4 Roman Colosseums. Its walls, which were originally 8 to 14 feet high, are nearly 1.25 miles in circumference. The ditch inside the walls is 12 feet deep, and the whole thing is almost perfectly circular, with a deviation from perfect circularity that modern engineers using modern equipment have calculated at less than 1%. Less than 1%. Built with wooden stakes and braided fiber cords. Built by people who, by the standard account, were hunter-gatherers with no fixed settlements, no writing, no metal tools, and no knowledge of advanced geometry. The octagon at Newark, connected to the Great Circle by a long avenue of parallel walls, is similarly perfect. Its 8 sides are equal, its corners are precisely placed, and its alignment is not accidental. The entire complex is oriented to the movements of the moon across its 18.5-year cycle, the full lunar standstill cycle. A phenomenon that requires decades of careful observation to even identify, let alone use as the basis for monumental architecture. Let that settle in for a moment. Whoever designed the Newark earthworks knew about the lunar standstill cycle. They knew it well enough to encode it in stone and earth, to align a structure 4 square miles in size to a celestial event that only becomes apparent if you watch the sky carefully for longer than most modern people watch anything. They had accumulated observations across multiple human lifetimes. They had found a way to preserve and transmit those observations, and they had the engineering knowledge to translate astronomical data into earthward geometry with an accuracy that modern GPS-equipped surveyors can only match, not exceed. This is not the work of a primitive people. This is the work of astronomers and engineers who happen to build in earth rather than stone. And the fact that they built in earth rather than the more durable materials that have preserved the monuments of Egypt, Rome, Greece, and China is probably the main reason their civilization has been so easy to overlook, to underestimate, and to quietly leave out of the story of human achievement. The question of why they built in earth rather than stone is itself interesting. Ohio and the surrounding region are not without stone. There are quarries within reasonable distance of most of the major Hopewell sites. Yet the Hopewell builders consistently chose Earth, not as a limitation, but apparently as a preference. The earthworks are not the best they could do. They're the best they chose to do in the medium they chose to use. Some researchers have suggested that the preference for Earth was deliberate, that it was connected to beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human and the natural, between the constructed landscape and the astronomical cycles that govern life. The mounds were not just engineering projects. They were statements about the world and humanity's place in it. Statements made in a language we're still learning to read. And there is one more thing about the Newark earthworks that tends not to make it into the general presentations. One more detail that sits at the edge of what mainstream archaeology is comfortable discussing. The geometry of the Newark complex is not unique to Newark. The same geometric relationships, the same proportions, the same alignments appear at other Hopewell sites across Ohio. At Chillicothe, at Marietta, at Portsmouth, the circles and octagons and squares repeat with variations, but the underlying geometric system remains consistent. This means that whoever was designing these earthworks was working from a shared set of geometric principles that was transmitted across hundreds of miles and several centuries. A shared system, a tradition of geometric knowledge that was maintained and applied at multiple sites by presumably multiple groups of people. A curriculum, a body of knowledge, a science, whatever you want to call it. That is what the evidence points toward. And the question of how that body of knowledge was preserved and transmitted through oral tradition, through physical models, through something else entirely, is one of the fascinating open questions that the archaeology has raised without yet being able to answer. The Hopewell tradition began to decline around 400 to 500 CE. The long-distance trade networks contracted. The elaborate mortuary practices faded. The construction of large geometric earthworks slowed and eventually stopped. The causes are debated, as they always are when a complex culture disappears from the archaeological record. Climate change, internal social stress, external pressure, epidemic disease, some combination of all of these. What is not debated is the fact that something remarkable ended. And what came after, while certainly not a simple reversion to pre-Hopewell conditions, was different in ways that suggest the specific knowledge and organizational capacity that produced the earthworks had been lost, or at least severely disrupted. But the story does not end there, because several centuries after Hopewell faded, something new began to grow in the central Mississippi Valley, and it was going to make everything that came before it look, in certain respects, modest. It was going to build a city. The word city carries a lot of freight. When most people hear it, they think of buildings, stone or brick or concrete, permanent structures that leave obvious traces in the landscape, streets, walls, the kind of physical legacy that survives for millennia in places like Rome or Athens or the ancient cities of the Near East. North America does not have many of those, which is one reason the story of pre-Columbian civilization in North America has been so easy to minimize. If you define city to mean stone buildings and paved streets, then you can say with a straight face that there were no cities in North America before Europeans arrived, and you will be technically correct in a way that obscures something important. Because what was built at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers beginning around 700 CE and reaching its peak around 1050 to 1100 CE was a city by every meaningful definition of that word. It had a dense population. It had social stratification. It had craft specialization. It had long-distance trade. It had monumental public architecture. It had a hinterland that it dominated and from which it extracted resources. It had neighborhoods. It had markets. It had a governing class whose power was expressed in death as clearly as in life. We call it Cahokia, and it is one of the most extraordinary places in North American history and one of the least known. At its height, Cahokia's population has been estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the central precinct, with perhaps another 100,000 in the surrounding region that was clearly connected to and dependent on the central site. These are estimates, and they are contested, but even the most conservative figures put Cahokia in the same population range as contemporary medieval European cities. London in 1100 CE had a population of around 15,000. Paris was perhaps 20,000. At the same moment in history, Cahokia was their equal in size and likely their superior in terms of the scale and ambition of its public works. The central feature of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, a structure so large that it tends to take people aback the first time they see it. Not because it rises dramatically from the plain, though it does rise dramatically, but because when you learn what it is made of and how it was built, the numbers become difficult to hold in your head. Monk's Mound is the largest earthen structure in the pre-Columbian Americas. It covers 14 acres at its base. It rises in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet, and it contains, archaeologists estimate, more than 22 million cubic feet of earth. All of it moved by human hands using baskets and wooden tools. All of it shaped and arranged and compacted with a precision that has allowed it to maintain its form for nearly 1,000 years. 22 million cubic feet of earth. No metal tools, no wheels, 22 million cubic feet. No wheels, no draft animals, human hands, human backs, human organization. And Monk's Mound is not alone. The Cahokia site, as it has been mapped by aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar and decades of careful excavation, contains more than 120 mounds within its central area. They vary in size and function. Some are platforms for temples or elite residences. Some are burial mounds. Some were markers of cosmic or political significance that we have not fully decoded. They are arranged across the landscape in patterns that reflect a sophisticated understanding of spatial organization and cosmological symbolism. Patterns that align with the cardinal directions and with celestial events and with each other in ways that suggest a unified plan executed over generations. The Grand Plaza, the open space at the heart of Cahokia, covers about 50 acres. 50 acres of level ground that was deliberately engineered from a naturally uneven landscape. The degree of leveling required and the precision with which it was achieved has impressed every engineer who has studied it. This was not clearing a field. This was reshaping the earth to serve a civic and ceremonial function using techniques that we have not fully reconstructed even now. The organization of space at Cahokia reflects a cosmology. North, south, east, west, above, below, the center. These are not just directions for the people who built Cahokia. They were fundamental organizing principles of the universe, and the city was built to embody them. Monk's Mound stands at the center. The cardinal directions are marked by other mounds and by wooden post circles. The latter, sometimes called wood hinges by researchers who are either reaching for an analogy or gesturing at a genuine cross-cultural parallel, depending on how you read the evidence. The wooden post circles at Cahokia are particularly interesting because they demonstrate unmistakably the same astronomical sophistication that we saw at Newark. The posts were arranged in circles ranging from several hundred to more than 1,000 feet in diameter, and their placement was calculated to mark solar events. The summer and winter solstices, the spring and fall equinoxes. Someone at Cahokia was watching the sky and encoding what they saw in the landscape, just as the Hopewell builders had done centuries earlier, though in a different form and with what appears to be a different purpose. The astronomical knowledge did not disappear when Hopewell faded. It was inherited, transformed, and put to work in a new urban context. Cahokia had craft production. Objects found at the site and in its hinterland include finely worked copper ornaments, shell beads and gorgets, ceramic vessels with artistic decoration that ranges from geometric patterns to elaborate figurative imagery. Flint tools work to a standard of precision that reflects dedicated craft specialization. There is evidence of dedicated production areas within the site, zones where particular crafts were concentrated, which suggests a degree of economic organization that goes well beyond household production for personal use. There was trade. The materials found at Cahokia come from an enormous geographic area, as they did at the Hopewell site centuries before. Copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, chert and flint from distant quarries. The trade networks of the Mississippian period, the broader cultural tradition of which Cahokia was the most spectacular expression, extended across the eastern half of the continent in ways that would have required ongoing relationships, agreements, and probably formal mechanisms for exchange. And then there was the political dimension of Cahokia, which is where the story gets most uncomfortable for those who prefer their pre-Columbian North America simple and egalitarian. Cahokia had a ruler or rulers. The evidence for this is unambiguous in the way archaeological evidence is allowed to be unambiguous. It is consistent, it is widespread, and no other interpretation fits it as well. Mound 72, a modest-sized burial mound near the center of the site, contained burials that tell a story about power and death that is frankly disturbing and unmistakably familiar. An individual who has come to be called the Beaded Burial Man was interred on a platform of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Around him and below him were the bodies of other people, mostly young women who appear to have been sacrificed. More than 250 additional bodies were found in multiple burial pits associated with this mound, many of them showing signs of mass sacrifice, of individuals who died not of natural causes, but at the command of someone with the power to demand their deaths. This is not the archaeology of an egalitarian society. This is the archaeology of a state, or something very close to it. A society in which power was concentrated, in which the lives of ordinary people were held at the discretion of those at the top, and in which death itself was an expression of the political order. Some researchers resist this conclusion because it complicates the narrative. A narrative of peaceful, egalitarian, spiritually attuned peoples living in harmony with the land and each other is politically useful in certain contexts. And there are genuine reasons to be skeptical of the old narratives that dismissed pre-Columbian peoples as savages. But the archaeology at Cahokia does not support either the old dismissal or the newer romanticization. It supports the conclusion that the people who built Cahokia were complex, capable, sometimes admirable, and sometimes by any moral standard you want to apply, brutal, just like every other civilization that has ever achieved a sufficient concentration of power. They were, in other words, human. The reach of Cahokia extended far beyond its central precincts. The Mississippian cultural tradition, which emerged from and was shaped by Cahokia's example, spread across the entire eastern half of North America over the course of several centuries. Mississippian sites, characterized by platform mounds, plazas, and the distinctive ceramic and artistic styles that originated in the central Mississippi Valley, appear from Florida to Minnesota, from the Atlantic coast to Oklahoma. Whether this spread represents actual migration of Cahokian people, the transmission of ideas and practices through existing networks, or some combination of the two, is debated by archaeologists. But the consistency of the pattern across such a vast area suggests something more than random cultural diffusion. Cahokia was exporting something: knowledge, practice, belief, political models, perhaps the physical presence of its people or its agents. Something moved outward from that central node and took root across a continent. and then Cahokia began to decline. The decline was gradual by archaeological standards, unfolding over roughly 2 centuries between about 1150 and 1350 CE. The population of the central site contracted. The construction of large mounds slowed. The long-distance trade connections weakened. Evidence of environmental stress, including deforestation and soil erosion from intensive farming, appears in the ecological records surrounding the site. There may have been social unrest. The defensive palisades that appear around the central area in the later period of Cahokia's occupation suggest anxiety about external threats that had not been apparent in the city's earlier centuries. By around 1350, Cahokia was essentially abandoned, not depopulated overnight, not destroyed in a single catastrophic event that we have been able to identify, but gradually, persistently, irreversibly emptied until the mounds that had been the center of a continental civilization stood alone in a landscape that was returning to forest. Why? The answers that have been proposed include climate change, specifically a series of droughts and floods associated with the medieval warm period and its end, along with the Little Ice Age that followed. Agricultural exhaustion of the surrounding land, political instability as the power structure that had organized the city became unable to maintain itself against internal and external pressures. Epidemic disease. Though this is harder to establish archaeologically at this date than it would be after European contact. Some combination of all of these. What is striking is the pattern. Poverty Point, a remarkable flourishing of organizational complexity, then collapse. Hopewell, an extraordinary network of exchange and monumental construction, then decline. Cahokia, an urban center of genuine sophistication, then abandonment. Each one building on what came before in certain ways. Each one adding something new, and each one ending in a way that left the knowledge and the organizational capacity and perhaps the specific people who carried them scattered, reduced, or lost. This is the pattern that the colonists walked into. Not emptiness, not wilderness, but the aftermath of several cycles of rise and fall, the most recent of which had played out over the preceding 3 or 4 centuries. The people they encountered were not the same as the people who had built the earthworks. Not entirely. There were connections. There were continuities. There were traditions that had survived the various collapses in modified forms. But the specific organizational capacity that had produced Cahokia and Newark and Poverty Point was gone, replaced by smaller, more localized cultures that were in most cases not building on that scale or that ambition. And yet the traces remained. The mounds were still standing when the colonists arrived, visible from a distance, impossible to ignore once you were near them. The oral traditions of many Eastern tribes contained references, sometimes specific and detailed, sometimes vague and mythologized, to a time when things had been different, when the ancestors had been more numerous, more organized, more powerful, when the land had been more thoroughly shaped by human hand. And the colonists noticed. That is the part of the story that tends to get left out or at least minimized. The earliest European accounts of the interior of North America are full of observations about the landscape that do not match the image of untouched wilderness that later mythology would construct. The Ohio River Valley, the first European explorers noted, had the appearance of a long-settled country. The forests in many areas showed evidence of deliberate management. The soil in certain river valleys was unusually dark and rich, a characteristic that later investigation would attribute to centuries of human modification. And the mounds were everywhere, too numerous to count, too large to miss, and too precisely constructed to explain away as natural features of the landscape. The early colonists who wrote about the mounds were not archaeologists. They did not have the conceptual framework to understand what they were seeing. But they were not stupid, and they were not entirely without curiosity. And what they wrote reveals a consistent pattern of reaction that can fairly be described as bewilderment, shading into awe, shading into fear. Fear because the scale of the constructions implied a population that was not supposed to have been there. Fear because the precision of the geometry implied a knowledge that was not supposed to have existed. Fear because the evidence in front of their eyes contradicted the story they needed to tell themselves to justify what they were doing. The story that said this land was empty, or as good as empty, that the people here were not organized enough or sophisticated enough or numerous enough to have any real claim to it. That story became harder to tell when you were standing at the base of Monk's Mound, looking up at something 100 feet tall and covering 14 acres. It became harder to tell when you mapped the Newark earthworks and realized that the geometry was more precise than anything your own engineers had built. It became harder to tell when you excavated a burial mound and found trade goods from across the continent. Copper worked with a skill that surpassed what your own craftsmen could achieve. So, the story was adjusted. The mounds were real, yes. The earthworks were impressive, yes. But they were not built by the ancestors of the people living here now. They were built by someone else, a lost race. Atlanteans, perhaps Israelites who had wandered to the New World, Vikings, Phoenicians, Welsh settlers following a mythological prince named Madoc. The specific theory varied depending on who was telling it and what agenda they were serving, but the underlying move was consistent. Credit the impressive constructions to anyone other than the people who were actually here. This is the origin of what has been called the Mound Builder myth. And it is one of the more instructive episodes in the history of American intellectual life. For roughly 2 centuries, from the colonial period through most of the 19th century, the dominant theory about who built the earthworks of North America was that they were constructed by a race of people who had been exterminated or displaced by the ancestors of the Native Americans encountered by European colonists. This theory was wrong. It was wrong in ways that were demonstrable, even with the limited archaeological tools of the time. But it was useful because it allowed the dispossession of native peoples to be framed as a second dispossession, a historical correction rather than an original crime. If the Mound Builders were a lost civilization destroyed by the ancestors of living indigenous peoples, then European settlers were simply continuing a pattern, taking land that had already been taken, arriving in the wake of a previous conquest. The actual archaeology told a different story from the beginning. The mounds were continuous with the cultures of the people who were living near them. The artistic traditions, the ceramic styles, the burial practices all showed connections between the pre-contact mound builders and the indigenous cultures of the historical period. The oral traditions of many tribes contain direct references to mound building as part of their own ancestral history. But these facts were inconvenient, and therefore minimized, contested, or simply ignored by the people with the power to shape the public narrative. It took until 1894, when the Bureau of American Ethnology published Cyrus Thomas's definitive study of the mounds and their connection to historical Native American cultures, for the mound builder myth to be officially debunked by mainstream science. And even then, the myth did not entirely die. It simply moved underground into the realm of popular speculation and amateur archaeology and certain religious traditions that had built theological structures around the idea of a lost people whose identity needed to be something other than Native American. We will come back to some of those alternative theories because they are part of the story too, part of the long, complicated human effort to make sense of evidence that does not fit the available categories. But first, we need to stay with the evidence itself for a while longer because there's more of it, and some of it is stranger than amounts. There's a road in the American Midwest that has been hiding in plain sight for 200 years. Not hiding deliberately, not concealed by conspiracy or covered by deliberate deception, but obscured by something almost worse, the assumption that it could not exist, and therefore the reluctance to see it even when it was directly underfoot. The road system of the Cahokian world is one of those facts that sits at the boundary between what the evidence shows and what the accepted story allows. And it has been generating low-level academic discomfort since the first serious surveys of the Mississippian region began. Because roads, actual engineered roads, require a level of political organization and engineering capability that the accepted story of pre-Columbian North America does not have a comfortable place for. Roads are built by states. They are maintained by states. They are used for the movement of goods, armies, officials, and ideas across territories that someone controls and someone administers. Roads, in short, imply civilization in the most straightforward possible sense. The Cahokians had roads, not as elaborate as Roman roads, not paved with stone, but engineered causeways and pathways that connected sites across the Mississippi River Valley with a consistency and scale that implies a planned transportation network rather than simply well-worn trails. The evidence comes from aerial photography, from LiDAR surveys, and from ground-level excavation, and it has been accumulating for decades. Linear earthworks connecting sites, causeways crossing low-lying terrain, pathways maintained to widths that suggest regular use by numbers of people carrying loads rather than individual hunters moving through the landscape. The Chaco Canyon road system in the American Southwest is better known and more extensively documented, which is itself revealing. The Southwest receives more archaeological attention than the Mississippi Valley in certain respects. Partly because the stone construction of the ancestral Puebloans leaves more visible traces, and partly because of the geography of research, funding, and institutional attention. But the Chaco roads are comparable in their implications. The Great North Road, one of the major arteries of the Chacoan system, runs for roughly 30 miles through the New Mexico desert with an almost perfect straightness that cannot be explained by simple foot traffic. It does not meander to follow the easiest terrain the way a path made by people choosing the most comfortable route would naturally do. It goes straight, cutting across hills rather than around them, crossing ravines with constructed ramps, maintaining its direction with a precision that required surveying, planning, and the ability to hold a line of sight across terrain that does not permit natural straight lines. Who builds roads like that? Administrators build roads like that. Officials who need to move information and goods and people quickly and reliably across a territory they control. Engineers who have the knowledge to survey a line and the authority to organize the labor needed to construct it. A political structure with a horizon that extends beyond the next season and the immediate needs of the people doing the work. The Chaco system at its height connected dozens of great houses, the large multi-story structures that archaeologists use as markers of Chacoan cultural influence, across an area of roughly 50,000 square miles in what is now New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. The roads did not connect these sites haphazardly. They connected them according to a system, with certain great houses serving as nodes in the network and others positioned at intervals along the main arteries in ways that suggest either planning from a central authority or the gradual elaboration of a system around established nodes. The great houses themselves are worth pausing over because they represent a level of architectural achievement that tends to get underplayed in the general accounts. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chacoan great houses, was a D-shaped, multi-story structure containing roughly 600 rooms and rising to 4 or 5 stories in its tallest sections. It was built from carefully shaped sandstone blocks, laboriously quarried, shaped, and fitted together with a skill that produced walls still standing 1,000 years later. The architectural achievement it represents in terms of planning, engineering, and coordinated labor is comparable to any contemporary construction in the medieval world. And it was not alone. The Chaco system contained multiple great houses of comparable scale connected by the road network, apparently serving functions that range from storage and redistribution of goods to ceremonial and astronomical observance, probably to governance and administration of some kind that we have not yet fully decoded. The astronomical dimension of Chaco is again deeply interesting. The great houses were aligned to solar and lunar events with a precision that required systematic observation over long periods. Certain rooms, certain doorways, certain interior alignments capture specific celestial events. The sunrise on the winter solstice, the moonrise at the lunar standstill, the shadow patterns created on specific dates by the sun falling across spiral petroglyphs carved into canyon walls. The convergence of astronomical knowledge and architectural expression at Chaco is so consistent and so precise that it has led researchers to propose that the great houses functioned partly as observatories, that the people who designed them were tracking celestial cycles and encoding what they learned in the built environment. The same people who built roads across 50,000 square miles of desert, the same people who organized the labor needed to move and shape millions of sandstone blocks, the same people whose trade network brought macaws from Mexico and copper bells from 1,000 miles away and turquoise from distant quarries in quantities that suggest not personal adornment, but ritual and political function. Chaco was not a simple place, and it did not arise from nowhere. It was connected through shared elements of material culture and possibly through direct relationships to a broader southwestern tradition that stretched deep into Mexico, to the Mesoamerican civilizations that were developing in complex and fascinating parallel to the south. The question of how much influence flowed northward from the civilizations of Mexico and Central America into what is now the American Southwest and beyond has been one of the most productive and contentious debates in North American archaeology for generations. Because if civilization in the American Southwest or the American Midwest was developing independently of any Mesoamerican influence, that tells one story about human cultural development. If it was developing in response to ideas, goods, and possibly people flowing northward from Mexico, that tells a different story, one with different implications for how we understand the cultural geography of the pre-Columbian Americas. The evidence for Mesoamerican influence in the north is real and substantial. The macaws found at Chaco were tropical birds that did not live in New Mexico and had to have been brought there from areas far to the south, areas under the cultural influence of Mesoamerican civilizations that valued the birds for their feathers. The copper bells found at Chacoan sites are made with a casting technique that was developed in Mesoamerica. Cacao, the plant from which chocolate is made, a profoundly Mesoamerican product with deep ritual significance in the cultures of Mexico and Central America, has been identified in residues from vessels at Chaco and at other southwestern sites. These are not small things. They are not the kind of goods that move casually along trade routes without carrying cultural meaning. Macaws, copper bells, and cacao are all items with specific ceremonial and social functions in the Mesoamerican world. When they appear hundreds of miles to the north, they suggest not just trade, but cultural transmission, the movement of ideas and practices along with objects. And there are more abstract parallels that are harder to explain, but equally difficult to dismiss. The ball game, a sport with profound ritual and political significance throughout Mesoamerica, appears in the American Southwest. evidenced by both the rubber balls that were used and the presence of what appear to be ball courts at certain sites. Pyramid-style platform mounds, though built from earth rather than stone in the north, echo the architectural logic of Mesoamerican temple platforms in ways that suggest shared underlying concepts about the relationship between elevated structures and sacred or political authority. The cosmological system at Cahokia, with its emphasis on the cardinal directions, the layers of the cosmos, and the relationship between celestial and earthly order, shows structural similarities to Mesoamerican cosmological frameworks that go beyond what coincidence easily explains. None of this means that Cahokia was a colony of Mexico, or that the builders of the Ohio earthworks were taking orders from the Maya. The relationships were complex, mediated by vast distances and multiple intervening cultures, filtered through local traditions and adapted to local conditions. But the idea that the great pre-Columbian civilizations of North America developed in complete isolation from their neighbors to the south requires increasingly strained arguments to maintain as the evidence accumulates. There is a world here, a connected world with relationships and exchanges and flows of ideas and goods that cross cultural boundaries and geographical distances in ways that the simple story of isolated primitive peoples does not account for. And that connected world had knowledge, not just the astronomical knowledge encoded in the earthworks, though that is remarkable enough. Knowledge of agriculture and its management at a scale that shaped landscapes across the continent. Knowledge of medicinal plants, refined over thousands of years of systematic observation, and accumulated in traditions that modern pharmacological research has only recently begun to take seriously. Knowledge of water management, of flood control, of the seasonal patterns that determined when to plant and when to move and where to camp. Knowledge of the stars that was detailed and precise and encoded in stories and ceremonies and architectural alignments that are still partially legible to anyone willing to look. And knowledge of the land itself. Knowledge so intimate and detailed and hard-won that it defies easy summary. The indigenous peoples of North America, the descendants in various ways of the people who built the earthworks and maintained the trade networks and watched the stars, developed over millennia one of the most comprehensive databases of ecological knowledge ever assembled. Which plants grew where and when and what they were good for. Which animals followed which routes in which seasons, how the weather behaved in different years, and what its variations signaled, how the rivers flooded and receded, and what the patterns meant for the people who depended on them. This knowledge was not written down. It was held in stories and ceremonies and songs and practices, transmitted from generation to generation through forms of education that looked nothing like formal schooling, but were rigorously effective at preserving complex and detailed information across centuries. It was held in the landscape itself, in the names given to places and the meanings attached to those names, in the routes of travel that had been walked for so long that they had become part of the inherited geography of the culture. And much of it was lost, not all at once, not completely, but substantially and in ways that are still being reckoned with. The catastrophe of European contact, with its epidemics and displacements and deliberate programs of cultural destruction, disrupted the transmission of indigenous knowledge in ways that will probably never be fully repaired. The specific techniques, the particular observations, the detailed local knowledge that had been accumulated over generations and encoded in cultural practices that were then suppressed or lost. This represents an epistemic tragedy of the first order, a destruction of human knowledge that rivals, in its consequences, any burning of any library. What survived, what was preserved and passed down and is now being documented and in some cases revitalized, is still extraordinary, but it is a fragment of what existed. This is the context in which the early colonists arrived. They walked into a landscape that had been managed and shaped and known with extraordinary intimacy by generations of people. A landscape that still showed, in its mounds and its dark soil and its managed forests and its precise trail networks, the traces of several cycles of complex civilization that had risen and fallen over the preceding 3,000 or 4,000 years. And they were frightened. Let's come back to that. Let's stay with that for a moment. The fear that the early colonists felt, or that some of them felt, or that filtered through into the records they left, was not simple fear of the unknown. It was something more specific. It was the fear of confronting evidence that did not fit the story. The story that said this land was empty, or as good as empty, waiting for them to fill it with their civilization, their God, their version of how the world should be organized. The mound said otherwise. The geometry of the earthworks said otherwise. The richness of the soil in the river valleys, the result of centuries of indigenous agricultural management, said otherwise. The scale of the populations that the earliest colonists encountered before the epidemics had done their worst said otherwise. Some of the colonists chose to face that evidence honestly. The Reverend Ephraim Squire and Dr. Edwin Davis, who conducted the first systematic survey of the Ohio Valley earthworks in the 1840s and published their findings in a landmark volume for the Smithsonian Institution in 1848, were among them. Their book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, is still worth reading, not just for its careful documentation of hundreds of sites, many of which have since been destroyed, but for the quality of wonder and intellectual honesty it brings to the evidence. Squire and Davis did not know who had built the earthworks, and they said so clearly. They recognized that the geometry, the astronomical alignments, the scale of the constructions required levels of knowledge and organization that they had not expected to find in pre-Columbian North America. And they said that too. They were right to be honest. They were right to let the evidence speak without forcing it into comfortable categories. And the discipline of archaeology in the century and a half since their survey has generally vindicated their caution and their intellectual humility while significantly expanding the picture they were able to draw. The picture that has emerged is extraordinary, not simple, not easily summarized, not comfortable for anyone who prefers their history to come in neat categories with clear villains and heroes and a straightforward narrative arc, but extraordinary. It is the picture of a continent that was home over the course of several thousand years to multiple cycles of complex cultural development, each one building on and departing for what came before, each one achieving remarkable things, each one ending in ways that leave questions open that we are still working to answer. It is a picture of a continent more thoroughly known, more deeply inhabited, more profoundly shaped by human hand and human mind than the story of empty wilderness allows. It is a picture of a world that was here before the world that replaced it, a world that left its traces in the soil and the earthworks and the genetic inheritance of the people who survived, and in the ecological knowledge that outlasted the civilizations that generated it. And it is a picture that is still being filled in, still being revised and extended and complicated by every new excavation, every new analysis of ancient DNA, every new application of remote sensing technology to landscapes that have never been properly mapped. The story is not over. It is barely begun. Every year, new discoveries add new dimensions to what we thought we understood. New sites are identified. New connections are traced. New dates are established that push the timeline further back or reveal complexity at periods we thought were simpler. New technologies allow us to see things that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. LiDAR, the laser-based remote sensing technology that has revolutionized archaeological survey in the past decade, has been changing the picture dramatically. In the Maya lands, LiDAR surveys have revealed a density of ancient construction, roads, agricultural features, urban infrastructure that was invisible from the ground and from conventional aerial photography. Comparable surveys in North America have begun to reveal similar levels of previously unknown complexity. Earthworks and enclosures and landscape features that have been sitting under the forest canopy for centuries, invisible to all but the most careful ground-level observation. We are only beginning to understand what is there. Let's talk about the copper, because the copper is one of those facts about pre-Columbian North America that tends to stop people cold when they hear the full extent of it, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets in the general accounts. The Great Lakes region of North America, particularly the area around Lake Superior, contains one of the largest deposits of native copper in the world. Native copper, meaning copper that occurs in a nearly pure metallic state in surface and near-surface deposits, without the need for smelting from ore, is extraordinarily rare. Most copper in the world is found in ores that require high-temperature processing to extract the metal. The Lake Superior deposits are exceptional, and the people who lived near them noticed, and the people who noticed changed everything about the cultural geography of eastern North America for several thousand years. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, represents perhaps the oldest tradition of systematic metalworking in the world. Copper objects from this tradition have been dated to as early as 7,000 years before the present, which makes them older than the Bronze Age in the Near East, older than the development of metallurgy in most of the world. These were not simple nuggets picked up from stream beds and hammered into shape. These were objects produced through a sophisticated understanding of the metal's properties, its malleability, its ability to be cold-worked and then annealed by heating, its behavior when worked repeatedly, and its tendency to crack if overworked without re-annealing. The artisans who produced old copper objects knew metallurgy, not smelting, not alloying, but the specific techniques of cold-working native copper that the metal's properties demanded. And they had developed those techniques to a level of sophistication that produced objects of extraordinary quality and variety. Projectile points, knives, axes, awls, fish hooks, bracelets, beads, gorgets, effigy figures, and dozens of other forms. All produced with a consistency and skill that implies dedicated craft specialization maintained over generations. And then the copper spread. The trade networks that move copper from its source in the Lake Superior region southward and eastward and westward across the continent are among the best documented aspects of pre-Columbian North American archaeology, simply because copper survives in the ground far better than most organic materials, and because the chemical signature of different copper deposits can be identified with modern analytical techniques, allowing researchers to trace specific objects back to their source. The copper appears in Poverty Point, 1,000 miles from the Great Lakes. It appears in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, where it was worked into elaborate ornamental forms that included representations of birds, humans, and abstract geometric designs of the highest artistic quality. It appears in Cahokian period sites across the Mississippi Valley. It appears at sites in Florida and in the Carolinas and in the Great Plains, and at every location where it appears, the presence of copper signals connection to the network. Participation in the exchange system that tied Eastern North America together across geographical distances that would have been formidable to cross. Think about what maintaining that network across 7,000 years of sustained use required. Generations of knowledge about where the copper was and how to get it. Relationships between distant communities maintained and renewed across the lifespan of individuals who might never travel to both ends of the network they participated in. Trust, because trade over long distances requires trust or force. And the copper network shows signs of being sustained by relationship rather than coercion, and a shared system of value, a mutual understanding of what copper was worth and what it was for, without which the exchange could not have functioned. The copper was sacred, not just valuable in the way a commodity is valuable, but sacred in the deeper sense, invested with spiritual significance, connected to cosmological beliefs, used not only for utilitarian purposes, but for ritual ones in ways that gave it a meaning beyond its material properties. The elaborate copper ornaments found in Hopewell burial mounds were not simply jewelry. They were identity markers, cosmological statements, expressions of relationship between the human and the spiritual that went far beyond what simple utility could account for. A culture that has been organizing, maintaining, and elaborating a trade network for sacred materials across 1,000 years is not a simple culture. That is the plain fact that the evidence requires us to acknowledge. But the copper trade, extraordinary as it is not the most puzzling aspect of the pre-Columbian archaeological record. That distinction belongs, in my view, to a set of facts that cluster around the question of what people knew and how they knew it. Facts that are individually explicable and collectively vertiginous. Start with the astronomy. We have already discussed the lunar alignments at Newark and the solar alignments at Cahokia's Woodhinges and the celestial orientation of the Chaco Great Houses. But the astronomical sophistication of pre-Columbian North America goes further than any individual site can show. There is a consistency of astronomical knowledge across cultures, separated by vast distances and long time periods, that implies either a shared intellectual tradition much older and more continuous than the visible monuments suggest, or human capacity for independent astronomical discovery that we have underestimated. The lunar standstill cycle, the 18.5-year oscillation in the moon's rising and setting points that is encoded in the Newark earthworks, requires decades of systematic observation to identify. Someone watching the moon every night for 20 years might begin to notice the pattern. Confirming it would require watching for another 20 years. Encoding it precisely enough to use it as the basis for a major architectural alignment would require observations across multiple generations. And using it at multiple sites consistently and accurately would require transmitting that knowledge across the generations with enough precision that it did not degrade. This is exactly the kind of knowledge that requires institutions to preserve and transmit, not necessarily the specific institutions we associate with civilization, universities and libraries and written records, but functional equivalents, organized bodies of practitioners, apprenticeship systems, formal ceremonies that encode knowledge in memorable and transmissible form, perhaps hierarchies of expertise in which those who had mastered the most complex and precise knowledge were distinguished from those who had not. The astronomical knowledge of pre-Columbian North America was not casual observation. It was science practiced by people whose social role was sufficiently distinguished from ordinary daily labor to allow them to spend the time and attention that science requires. The same is true of the geometric knowledge embodied in the earthworks, the circles and octagons of the Hopewell tradition, the precisely aligned plazas and mounds of Cahokia, the sophisticated spatial organization of the Chacoan Great House system. All of these reflect a mastery of practical geometry that requires training, practice, and the accumulated experience of a tradition. You do not lay out a circle a mile and a quarter in circumference with less than 1% deviation from perfection by accident, or by intuition, or by any process that does not involve systematic knowledge that has been refined over time. Geometry is learnable, but it has to be learned from someone who knows it. It has to be transmitted in some form, oral or physical or both, that is precise enough to preserve the specific techniques and knowledge that make the precision possible. And the person who transmits it has to have had it transmitted to them by someone else, and so on back through the generations. This is a tradition, an intellectual tradition maintained and transmitted across time in the way that intellectual traditions are maintained and transmitted by people who value and practice them within social structures that support and reward that valuation and practice. The earthwork builders had such a tradition. The astronomical observers had such a tradition. The coppersmiths had such a tradition. The ceramic artists whose work ranges from simple utility to breathtaking formal complexity had such a tradition. The traders who maintained continent-spanning networks of exchange had such a tradition. What is the name of a society that maintains multiple sophisticated intellectual and craft traditions across generations, organized well enough to produce monumental public works of astronomical precision, and connected across continental distances through systematic exchange of goods and ideas? Whatever name you want to give it, it is more than the prevailing story allows for. Now let us come to the part of this story that is genuinely contested, genuinely uncertain, and genuinely important to engage with honestly, because the alternative is to leave the field to people whose engagement with it is not honest. There are things about pre-Columbian North America that the evidence does not yet explain satisfactorily. The precision of the earthwork geometry is one. We can say it was achieved, but we have not found the instruments or the written records of the methods that would tell us exactly how. The speed of Cahokia's rise is another. The city appears to have grown very rapidly in the early 11th century in ways that suggest either an unusual migration event or an unusual organizational capacity that we have not explained. The nature of Hopewell as a phenomenon, whether it was an actual political entity or simply a shared cultural package, remains debated. The source of certain specific astronomical knowledge, whether it was independently developed or transmitted from elsewhere, is not settled. These are genuine open questions. They are interesting. They deserve serious investigation. But they have also attracted a different kind of attention. Attention that uses the genuine uncertainty to build alternative narratives that go far beyond what the evidence supports. The Mound Builder myth, as we noted, projected these impressive works onto a hypothetical lost race rather than the actual ancestors of living Native American peoples. More recent versions of the same impulse project them onto ancient Egyptians, ancient Hebrews, ancient Africans, ancient visitors from any number of old world civilizations, ancient astronauts. The specific theory varies. The underlying move is always the same. Find something that seems too impressive to have been done by the people who actually did it and attribute it to someone else. This is intellectually dishonest. It is also, when examined carefully, a form of racism, because the implicit assumption is always that the indigenous peoples of North America were not capable of the things their constructions demonstrate they achieved. The only way to conclude that the earthworks required outside help is to start from the premise that their builders could not have done it themselves. And that premise is contradicted by everything we actually know about human cognitive capacity and cultural development. People, all people everywhere, have always been capable of remarkable things when conditions permitted and incentivized them. The earthwork builders of pre-Columbian North America were no different. They had the same brains, the same capacity for learning and innovation and cultural accumulation that every other human population has had. What they did not have was the specific set of material advantages: metals, wheeled domestic animals for heavy labor, stone in certain regions, that characterized the civilizations of the Old World. They worked with what they had. What they built with what they had is extraordinary. That should be enough. It should be more than enough. The true story of pre-Columbian North America The story the evidence actually tells is more interesting and more remarkable than any of the alternative narratives that have been constructed to replace it. It does not need ancient astronauts or lost continents or secret old world visitors to be extraordinary. It just needs to be told honestly, in full, without the minimization and the silences that have characterized so much of the public account. Let us continue telling it. The question of population is one of the most contentious in all of North American archaeology, and it bears directly on the question of what kind of civilization was possible in the pre-Columbian period. For much of the 20th century, the standard estimates for pre-contact Native American populations were very low, in the range of a few million for all of the Americas combined, sometimes less. These low estimates served a specific ideological function. They made the land seem emptier, the people fewer, the dispossession less significant in scale. But they were not supportable on the evidence, and over the past several decades, they have been revised substantially upward. Current estimates, based on a combination of archaeological evidence, analysis of historical accounts from the earliest European contacts, ecological modeling of the carrying capacity of pre-Columbian land management systems, and genetic analysis of population histories, put the pre-contact population of the Americas in a range from 30 to 100 million people, with the central estimates clustering around 50 to 60 million. North America alone may have had a population of 12 to 15 million or more at the time of European contact. These are not small numbers. They represent a continent that was thoroughly inhabited, thoroughly organized, thoroughly shaped by the presence of millions of people living in complex societies with sophisticated resource management systems. And then the epidemics came. The epidemics that followed European contact were among the worst demographic catastrophes in human history. Some researchers estimate that in the century following initial European contact, the Native American population of the Americas declined by as much as 90%. 90%. From 50 million people to 5 million in 100 years, or from whatever the actual numbers were, they were enormous to a fraction of what they had been. Disease did most of this killing, not violence, though violence was certainly a factor. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, and dozens of other pathogens to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. These diseases moved faster than the European colonists themselves. In many cases, the epidemics preceded direct contact by decades, spreading along existing trade networks from coastal points of initial introduction deep into the interior. When European explorers and settlers arrived in areas that had not yet seen a European face, they sometimes found landscapes that had been partially emptied by epidemics that had arrived years or even decades before them. This is why the landscape the colonists described, and the landscape that later mythology turned into the image of pristine wilderness, was not actually pristine. It was post-catastrophic. The forests that seemed to stretch untouched to the horizon had been managed forests a century before, shaped by deliberate burning and selective harvesting that maintained the diversity and productivity that made them appear so remarkable to European eyes. The game that seemed inexhaustible had been managed by hunting practices calibrated to population levels that had now crashed. The dark, rich soil of the river valleys was the product of centuries of indigenous agriculture that had ended within living memory, or within a generation or two of the first European arrivals. The wilderness was not nature untouched by human hand. It was the aftermath of civilization, the landscape that remained when the people who had maintained it were suddenly, catastrophically gone. Hernando de Soto, the Spanish explorer who led an expedition through the American Southeast from 1539 to 1542, encountered a very different landscape from the one that later colonists would describe. He found dense populations, large towns, organized political structures, sophisticated military capabilities, and evidence of complex social organization at every turn. The accounts of his expedition describe a southeast that was thoroughly inhabited and organized, with towns sometimes separated by distances of only a few miles, with agricultural systems capable of producing surplus stores that De Soto's expedition simply took when it needed them, and with political structures ranging from simple chiefdoms to what appear to have been genuinely complex confederacies. A century later, when the English were beginning their serious colonization of the same region, much of what De Soto had described was gone. The populations had collapsed. The towns were abandoned or much reduced. The political structures had fragmented under the combined pressure of epidemic disease, the trade disruptions caused by early European contact, and the slave raid that had been going on since Spanish slavers began working the coasts in the early 16th century. What the English colonists saw, therefore, was not what had been there before the Spanish arrived. It was what remained after half a century or more of disruption. And what remained, while still impressive by any objective standard, was a shadow of what had existed. This context matters enormously for understanding the mounds and the earthworks and the evidence of complex pre-Columbian civilization, because it explains partially why the colonists found it so difficult to reconcile what they saw in the archaeological record with what they observed in the living populations around them. The populations they observed had been through a catastrophe without precedent in their history. They were not the same in number or in organization or in the specific knowledge and practices that complex civilization requires as the populations that had built the things the colonists were seeing. This is not a small distinction. A civilization that has lost 90% of its population in 2 or 3 generations has also lost, in all probability, a disproportionate share of its specialists, its knowledge keepers, its institutional memory, the healers who knew the medicinal plants, the astronomers who tracked the lunar standstill, the master builders who knew how to survey and lay out geometric earthworks with super precision, the traders who maintained the relationships and the knowledge of the networks, the priests who held the cosmological knowledge that gave all of it meaning. These are not common people. They were specialists, often marked as such by their social roles and their material circumstances. And specialists are disproportionately vulnerable to demographic catastrophe, because there are fewer of them to begin with, and because the apprenticeship systems that transmit specialized knowledge require long periods of close personal contact to function. When the specialists die, the knowledge dies with them. Not entirely, never entirely, but enough that what remains is a fragment of what existed. Often a fragment that the survivors themselves no longer fully understand. The colonists did not encounter the civilization that built the mounds. They encountered the survivors of that civilization's collapse. Survivors who were themselves in the process of rebuilding, adapting, finding new ways to maintain identity and knowledge and practice in the aftermath of catastrophe. They encountered people who were in some cases as mystified by the ancient earthworks as the colonists were, though for very different reasons, and they encountered people who were in other cases entirely clear about their connection to the ancient constructions and their meaning. Because the catastrophe was not complete, and the knowledge was not entirely lost, and the oral traditions that carried the cultural memory across generations had survived even when the specific technical knowledge had been disrupted. The question of what the descendants of the Mound Builders knew and remembered about their ancestors' achievements is one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated aspects of this whole story. Because the oral traditions of many Eastern Native American peoples contain detailed references to the mounds and their significance that was systematically ignored by the European colonists and scholars who could have learned from them, in favor of the more comfortable theory that the mounds were built by a lost and separate race. The Natchez people of the lower Mississippi Valley, who were still practicing a form of sun worship and maintaining a political structure centered on a divine chief called the Great Sun at the time of European contact, described their own history in terms that connected them directly to the mound building tradition. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples of the Southeast had oral traditions that described mound building as part of their ancestral history, often associated with specific migrations and political formations. The Cherokee carried stories about the earthworks that, when examined carefully, contain elements that match the archaeological record in ways that could not be coincidental. But the most striking and perhaps most significant oral traditions are those that describe not the construction of the mounds, but the abandonment of them. Because those traditions often describe catastrophic events, floods, droughts, epidemics, wars, social collapses, the kinds of events that are consistent with what the archaeology suggests about the end of the various cycles of mound-building civilization. These are not simple myths in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. They are historical accounts encoded in the narrative forms that non-literate cultures use to preserve and transmit historical memory, and they deserve the same respect that we give to the historical accounts encoded in the literary forms of literate cultures. The Iliad is not literally true in every detail, but no serious scholar dismisses it as a historical source. The oral traditions of Native American peoples about their own history deserve the same critical but respectful engagement. When those traditions describe a time before the present time, when people were more numerous and built larger things and knew more. When they describe catastrophes that caused those people to scatter and lose what they had built, they're not simply making things up. They are describing, in the terms available to them, something that the archaeology confirms happened. And that convergence between oral tradition and archaeological evidence is one of the most powerful arguments available for the reality of what the evidence shows. Something remarkable was built here. Something remarkable was lost. And the memory of both, fragmented and transformed, but recognizable, persists in the traditions of the people who survived. There's a place in Illinois, not far from St. Louis, where you can still stand at the summit of Monk's Mound and look out across the floodplain of the Mississippi and try to imagine what it looked like 1,000 years ago. The view today is dominated by modern infrastructure, highways and suburbs, and the distant glitter of the city skyline. But if you know what to look for, if you know where to place the missing elements, you can reconstruct in your mind something of what was there. The plazas, the other mounds, more than 100 of them, rising from the flat ground in patterns that map the cosmological beliefs of their builders. The wooden palisade that eventually surrounded the central precincts, a wall several miles long constructed from massive timber posts set deep in the earth. The neighborhoods beyond the central area, dense with houses and storage structures and the activity of tens of thousands of people. The agricultural fields stretching outward to the horizon, managed with an intensity that had darkened and enriched the soil for miles. The canoes on the river, trading goods moving in both directions along the most productive waterway on the continent. And at the center of all of it, rising above everything else, the flat-top summit of Monk's Mound, where you're standing now. And on that summit, a building, a large building. We know from the post holes and the prepared floor surfaces that excavation has revealed. A building significant enough in size and construction to have required major effort and major materials. A building that was almost certainly the residence or the ceremonial space of whoever held the highest authority in the Cahokian world. You would have been visible from miles away, standing there. The mound itself would have been visible from much further. The earthwork rises 100 feet above the surrounding plain, and in a flat landscape like the Mississippi floodplain that is visible from an extraordinary distance. This was not incidental. This was architecture as political statement, as cosmological declaration, as the assertion of a center around which everything else was organized. The person who stood at the top of Monk's Mound in the year 1100 CE commanded a city that was larger than any in contemporary England, that was connected to the rest of the continent through trade networks reaching to the Gulf Coast and the Rocky Mountains and the Great Lakes, that had achieved a level of astronomical and engineering knowledge that we are still working to fully understand. That person presided over civilization. The word is not too strong. The resistance to using it reflects a double standard that is worth naming plainly. If a comparable set of characteristics, large population, monumental public works, long-distance trade, craft specialization, social stratification, astronomical knowledge, were found in an old world context, nobody would hesitate to call it a civilization. The hesitation in the North American context reflects a set of assumptions about what counts as civilization that are based more on the specific forms taken by old world civilizations than on the underlying organizational and intellectual achievements that the concept is supposed to capture. Literacy matters, but it is not the only thing that matters. The absence of a writing system we have been able to identify does not mean the absence of the organizational capacity and the accumulated knowledge that writing serves to preserve and transmit. It means that knowledge was preserved and transmitted differently through the oral traditions and architectural alignments and material culture and social practices that the archaeological record documents. Different, yes. Less sophisticated? The earthworks say no. Metal tools matter. But the absence of iron or bronze does not mean the absence of sophisticated understanding of materials and their properties. The copper working of the old copper complex and the Hopewell tradition demonstrates metallurgical knowledge that is not inferior to contemporary old world metallurgy in its understanding of the metal being worked, just in the specific metal available to be worked. Monumental stone architecture matters as a marker that tends to preserve well and impress easily. But the absence of stone monuments does not mean the absence of monumental ambition or architectural achievement. The earthworks of Eastern North America represent an investment of labor that compares favorably in sheer scale to the stone monuments of the Old World. They just do not last as long, because earth is more vulnerable to erosion and to the plow than stone is. The point is not to rank civilizations or to claim that the pre-Columbian North American tradition was equivalent in all respects to the traditions of the Old World. Different traditions develop different things. They excel in different areas. They organize knowledge differently. They express their most important values differently. What the pre-Columbian North American tradition achieved was remarkable on its own terms. And those terms deserve to be understood on their own, not measured against a standard derived from a completely different cultural and ecological context. What was remarkable about it is worth dwelling on, because it is genuinely remarkable and genuinely underappreciated. The management of the North American landscape before European contact was a feat of ecological engineering that we are only beginning to understand. For centuries, the dominant narrative described the pre-Columbian continent as a wilderness, a natural state untouched by significant human modification. That narrative is wrong, and the evidence that demonstrates its wrongness has been accumulating for decades in the work of ecologists, archaeologists, geographers, and researchers in indigenous land management. The forests of eastern North America were not untouched wilderness. They were managed landscapes, shaped by centuries of deliberate burning, selective harvesting, and intentional cultivation that maintained the specific composition and structure that made them seem, to European eyes, so abundantly productive. The passenger pigeons, whose flocks reportedly darkened the sky, were responding to a landscape that had been managed to produce the kind of mass production, the acorns and beech nuts and chestnuts that were their primary food that the management practices maintained. The deer and the elk and the turkey and the other game that seemed so incredibly abundant were living in a landscape shaped to support them, not simply in a natural state that happened to be productive. The dark, rich soils of the river valleys that so impressed European observers were not natural gifts. They were the product of centuries of indigenous agricultural practice, deliberate soil modification, composting, crop rotation, the cultivation of complementary crops that maintained soil fertility, and the accumulation of organic material from long occupation and careful land management. Researchers have identified these anthropogenic dark earths, sometimes called terra preta by analogy with the similar soils found in Amazonia, at multiple locations across eastern North America, and they represent exactly the kind of long-term, systematic, knowledgeable land management that a complex civilization practices. The Amazon itself, which to European eyes seemed the ultimate wilderness, the most obviously untouched and natural landscape on Earth, has turned out to be one of the most dramatically modified human landscapes on the planet. The LiDAR surveys and the soil analyses and the botanical studies that have been conducted over the past few decades have revealed a forest that was extensively managed, extensively cultivated, extensively modified by millennia of deliberate human activity. The specific tree species composition of large sections of the Amazon reflects thousands of years of human planting and management. The famous terra preta soils of the Amazon basin represent the accumulated agricultural modification of a landscape by millions of people over thousands of years. If the Amazon was managed, if the eastern forests of North America were managed, what does that tell us about the sophistication and the scale of the land management traditions that produced those modifications? It tells us that the management was systematic. It was intergenerational. It was based on accumulated knowledge of ecological processes that rivals, in its practical sophistication, anything produced by the contemporary scientific traditions of Europe. The people who managed these landscapes knew things. They knew how fire behaved in different vegetation types and seasons, and how to use it to achieve specific goals. They knew which plants responded to which kinds of management, and how to encourage the ones they wanted at the expense of the ones they did not. They knew the cycles of animal behavior, and how to manage hunting pressure to maintain populations rather than deplete them. They knew the water cycles and the soil chemistry and the seed germination requirements of the plants they cultivated. They did not know these things in the form of scientific papers and laboratory protocols. They knew them in the form of accumulated experience encoded in cultural practices and oral traditions and seasonal observances, and in the specific ways that children were taught to observe and participate in land management activities from an early age. But the knowledge was real. The effects it produced are measurable. The landscapes it created supported larger human populations at higher standards of material well-being than the wilderness that is supposed to have been all that existed before European contact. This knowledge has not entirely disappeared. It persists in fragmented and sometimes attenuated form in the traditions of indigenous communities who have maintained connections to their ancestral land management practices despite everything that was done to suppress and destroy those traditions. And it is increasingly being recognized by ecologists and land managers as something that modern resource management has a great deal to learn from. Not as a romantic gesture toward the past, but as a practical acknowledgement that a tradition refined over thousands of years of systematic observation and practice has insights that laboratory science is only beginning to replicate. The controlled burns that fire management programs in the American West now use to prevent the catastrophic wildfires that have been increasing in recent decades are a pale shadow of the sophisticated fire management practices that indigenous peoples maintained across the continent for millennia. The recognition that diverse, mixed-species agricultural systems are more resilient and productive in the long run than industrial monocultures, echoes the Three Sisters agriculture of the eastern woodlands, where corn and beans and squash were grown together in combinations that maintained soil fertility, reduced pest pressure, and provided a balanced diet that modern nutritional science has confirmed was remarkably complete. The knowledge that was here, the knowledge embedded in these practices and in the oral traditions and in the specific ways of relating to and managing the landscape, was a form of wealth. Not the kind of wealth that can be counted or traded or accumulated in ways that are obvious to outside observers, but wealth nonetheless in the most fundamental sense. The accumulated resources of human understanding, hard-won over generations, refined by experience, organized into systems that worked. And it was treated as worthless, not everywhere, not by everyone, not in a simple or uncomplicated way, but substantially and systematically by the processes of colonization that dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive superstition and indigenous land management as the absence of management, and that justified the replacement of existing systems with imported ones on the grounds that the imported systems were superior. They were different. In some respects, they were more immediately productive in the narrow sense of extracting more material value from the land in the short term. In many other respects, they were not superior. And in the long-term ecological sense of producing landscapes that remain productive and habitable across centuries, they were often dramatically inferior. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was partly a failure of the agricultural practices brought to the Great Plains by European settlers. Practices that replaced the complex, deep-rooted grassland ecology that the indigenous peoples of the region had managed for centuries with a simplified, shallow-rooted grain cultivation that could not maintain the soil under the climatic stresses that the plains regularly experienced. The catastrophic wildfires of the contemporary American West are partly the result of a century of fire suppression that replaced the sophisticated fire management practices of indigenous peoples with a blanket policy that allowed fuel loads to accumulate to levels that make fires, when they come, far more destructive than they would otherwise be. These are not simply historical facts. They are current problems. And part of the reason they are hard to solve is that the knowledge that might help solve them was systematically disregarded for so long that we have to work to reconstruct it, often from fragmentary sources, when we should have been learning from it all along. But this is not a story about failure, or not only a story about failure. It is also a story about persistence and resilience, and the remarkable human capacity to carry knowledge and meaning and identity across catastrophes that would seem from the outside to have destroyed everything. The peoples were the descendants of the Mound Builders and the earthwork engineers and the astronomical observers and the coppersmiths and the continent-spanning traders are still here. They have survived everything. They have maintained in forms that have necessarily changed and adapted, but that preserve real continuity with what came before, the languages and the ceremonies and the relationships to land and to each other that connect them to the tradition that built the earthworks. They are not museum pieces. They are not relics. They are living communities with contemporary concerns and contemporary achievements and contemporary contributions to the ongoing project of human civilization. And they carry as part of their inheritance a connection to a history that is more extraordinary than the story that was told about them. That story, the one that minimized and dismissed and systematically replaced the actual history with a convenient fiction, is increasingly untenable. The archaeology is too consistent. The evidence is too clear. The accumulation of specific, detailed, technically sophisticated knowledge demonstrated by the earthworks and the trade networks and the astronomical alignments is too large to be explained away. Something remarkable was here. Something remarkable happened here. And the story of what it was, and how it worked, and what ended it, and what survived it is one of the great untold stories of human history. It is in the process of being told, slowly and imperfectly, and with all the complications that any honest historical account must have, but told nonetheless. Let's keep telling it. The Serpent Mound of Adams County, Ohio, is one of those places that changes the people who visit it. Not in any mystical sense, or not only in a mystical sense, but in the more straightforward sense that it confronts you with something your previous mental categories cannot fully contain. And the adjustment of those categories is felt as something more than an intellectual event. The Serpent Mound is exactly what the name suggests. A mound in the shape of a serpent nearly a quarter of a mile long. Its body coiling and curving across the landscape in 7 curves before ending in a triple coiled tail. Its head opening to swallow or release what appears to be an oval shape, which has been interpreted as an egg, a sun symbol, a heart, or some combination of these meanings. The serpent's head is oriented toward the sunset at the summer solstice, which is probably not accidental. The mound was built by hands. Thousands of cubic feet of earth shaped into the precise form of a snake, curved in proportion with a skill and attention to form that reflects both genuine artistic intention and genuine engineering capability. The curves are not random. They are regular, consistent, and related to each other in ways that suggest a design that was worked out before construction began and executed with sufficient control to produce the intended shape at the intended scale. Who built it, and one is not entirely settled. Early dating put the construction in the Adena period, roughly 300 BCE to 100 CE. More recent radiocarbon dating of associated charcoal deposits has suggested a later date closer to 1000 CE, which would place it in the Fort Ancient cultural period that followed the Hopewell decline. The question of who built it and what tradition of knowledge and belief it reflects remains open. But what is not in question is that it was built deliberately in a specific form, oriented in a specific astronomical direction, by people who knew what they wanted to create and had the skill and organization to create it. And that it has lasted for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years in recognizable form, preserving across that span of time the specific vision of whoever designed it. That persistence matters. It is another piece of the argument for the seriousness and the intentionality of the tradition that produced the earthworks. These were not casual constructions. They were not improvised responses to immediate needs. They were expressions of something that their builders considered important enough to invest enormous effort in, and important enough to build in a form and at a scale that they could reasonably expect to outlast their own lifetimes and the lifetimes of their children. They were building for the future. They were building something they wanted to still be there for generations to come. And in that ambition, that reaching forward across time through the medium of a physical construction, they're doing something that is recognizably human in the way that the most human things are recognizable across cultures and centuries. The impulse to leave a mark, to say I was here, and this is what I knew, and this is what I thought was important, is one of the most consistent features of human behavior across the entire archaeological record. It shows up in handprints on cave walls 40,000 years ago. It shows up in the pyramids of Egypt and the cathedrals of Europe and the steel and glass towers of contemporary cities. It shows up in the earthworks of pre-Columbian North America, in the specific and careful forms that the people who built them chose to impose on the landscape. They were saying something. We are still learning to read what they said. There is a category of evidence that archaeologists call exotic materials, which is a technical term for trade goods that appear far from their geographic source. The exotics found in the burial contexts of the major pre-Columbian North American sites have been one of the most productive areas of research in recent decades, because the chemical and isotopic analysis of these materials allows researchers to trace them back to specific sources, building a map of the trade networks that connected distant communities across the continent. The maps that have emerged from this work are astonishing in their spatial extent and their temporal persistence, and they raise questions that go beyond simple economics. Consider the marine shells. Conch shells and whelk shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast appear in burial mounds throughout the interior of the continent, including in sites more than 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. They appear in Adena graves in Ohio. They appear in Hopewell burial complexes along the Illinois and Ohio rivers. They appear in Mississippian contexts throughout the Southeast. And they're not raw material. They are worked, often elaborately so, into ornaments and containers and ritual objects that reflect a sophisticated understanding of the shell's symbolic significance within a cosmological system we are still reconstructing. The conch shell specifically appears to have had deep cosmological significance across much of eastern North America. It is associated with water, with the underworld, with serpents, and with the cycles of death and regeneration. Its sound, when it is used as a trumpet, carries a resonance that has been described in ritual contexts across many cultures as the voice of the spirit world or the sound of the cosmic waters. Whatever specific meanings it carried in the traditions of the people who used it, it was clearly more than a decorative material. It was a medium of cosmological statement. The shell was traded across 1,000 miles because what it represented was worth 1,000 miles of effort. That is a statement about the depth and seriousness of the belief system that gave it that value. The mica from the southern Appalachians is similarly telling. Mica is a mineral that cleaves into thin, flexible, reflective sheets, and it was used in the Hopewell tradition to create cutouts in the shapes of birds, hands, serpents, human figures, and abstract geometric forms. These cutouts were placed in graves, sometimes in quantities that represent hundreds of hours of careful cutting and shaping. They reflect light in ways that create an effect of shimmering, of movement, of a surface that is neither quite solid nor quite liquid. And that effect was presumably intentional and cosmologically meaningful. The mica came from sources in North Carolina and Georgia, and it moved northward to Ohio, where most of the elaborately worked Hopewell mica objects have been found, and to other points across the interaction sphere. The movement was not casual. The quantities involved, which archaeological excavations have revealed to be substantial, required organized collection, transport, and distribution. Someone was managing the mica supply chain with enough reliability and consistency to keep the Hopewell workshop supplied for several centuries. The obsidian is perhaps the most dramatic example. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that produces the sharpest cutting edges available to Stone Age technology, was highly prized across the pre-Columbian world for its cutting qualities and for its visual properties, the glossy black sheen and the reflective quality that made it cosmologically significant as a mirror into other worlds in many Mesoamerican traditions. In the Hopewell sites of Ohio, obsidian appears in quantities that represent substantial investment in transport, because the nearest significant obsidian sources are in the Yellowstone region of Wyoming and in the mountains of northern Mexico, both more than 1,000 miles from the Ohio River Valley. The Hopewell obsidian has been chemically analyzed, and the results are striking. It comes from multiple sources, including both Wyoming and Mexico, suggesting not a single distant trading relationship, but multiple connections reaching in different directions simultaneously. This is not the trade of necessity, of simple exchange of surplus goods between neighboring communities. This is the trade of a culture that valued and sought specific materials from specific places across a continent, and had the organizational capacity and the relationship networks to obtain them. The picture that all of this evidence creates is of a North American continent crossed by multiple overlapping long-distance networks of exchange that connected communities from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Shield. These networks moved not just goods but ideas, artistic styles, cosmological concepts, and probably people. They were maintained not by simple barter between neighboring communities, but by long-term relationships of alliance and obligation that required ongoing investment of social and political capital. They were, in the broadest sense, a system, a continental system of communication and exchange that represented one of the most extensive and durable organized interactions in pre-Columbian human history. Understanding that system, its scale, its sophistication, and its persistence is essential to understanding what the colonists walked into and why they were so unsettled by what they found. They were not encountering scattered bands of nomads in an empty wilderness. They were encountering the remnants and survivors of a continental system that had been running in various forms and with various interruptions for several thousand years. The specific form it was in at the moment of contact had been shaped by the catastrophes of the preceding centuries. The demographic collapse following the initial disease exposure, the disruption of the trade networks, the contraction of the political structures that had organized the major centers. But the system was still there, attenuated, disrupted, partially collapsed, but recognizably there in the structure of the relationships and the movement of goods and the shared cosmological frameworks that connected communities across vast distances. And the colonists, encountering it, were forced to make sense of it with conceptual tools that were not adequate to the task. They could see that there were people here. They could see that those people were organized in ways that went beyond simple family groups. They could see, when they bothered to look carefully, which not all of them did, that the landscape showed signs of management and modification and long occupation. And they could see the earthworks, the mounds, the geometric enclosures, the astronomical alignments encoded in the landscape. What they could not do, or would not do, was let all of that evidence lead them to the conclusion it actually supported. The conclusion that the people they were encountering were the inheritors, diminished and disrupted, but real, of a tradition of cultural achievement that had no reason to be called primitive and every reason to be called remarkable. That conclusion was politically inconvenient. It complicated the story that was needed to justify what was being done. And so it was avoided, sometimes through honest intellectual failure, and sometimes through deliberate misdirection, in ways that shaped the public understanding of North American history for centuries and continue to shape it today, though with decreasing success as the evidence accumulates. The evidence is accumulating faster than ever. The application of new analytical techniques to old collections, the use of LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies to map landscapes that have never been properly surveyed. The integration of genetic analysis with archaeological evidence to trace population movements and relationships. The growing recognition in the scientific community of the depth and sophistication of indigenous ecological knowledge. All of these are adding detail and complexity and specificity to the picture at a rate that makes the previous minimizations increasingly difficult to maintain. New sites are being found. New connections are being established. New dates are being determined that push the timeline of specific achievements further back and reveal complexity at periods we thought were simpler. In 2020, LiDAR surveys in Louisiana revealed an entire complex of earthwork structures at a site called Poverty Point's predecessor. showing that the tradition of organized earthwork construction in the lower Mississippi Valley is even older than the 5,000-year dates previously established, and that the scale of the early constructions was larger and more elaborate than had been recognized from ground-level survey. In the American Southwest, ongoing work at Chaco Canyon and related sites continues to reveal the sophistication of the astronomical and engineering knowledge embedded in the great houses, with new analyses showing alignments and relationships that had not been recognized in previous surveys. In the Southeast, surveys using ground-penetrating radar at sites that have been known for decades but never fully excavated are revealing the density and complexity of the occupation, showing that what seemed like modest sites were actually much larger and more internally complex than surface evidence suggested. And in all regions, the growing recognition of indigenous oral traditions as historical sources rather than simple mythology to be decoded or dismissed is adding dimensions to the picture that purely material archaeology cannot provide. The stories that indigenous communities have maintained about their own histories are being taken more seriously as sources of specific historical information, and in many cases they are proving to be remarkably accurate about specific events and conditions that the archaeology confirms. The convergence of archaeological evidence and oral historical tradition is one of the most exciting developments in the field, because it means that we are not just reading the material record, but beginning to connect it to the human meaning that the material was created to express. The earthworks are not just engineering projects. They were statements, cosmological declarations, expressions of belief and identity and understanding about the relationship between human beings and the cosmos. What they were saying is becoming clearer as the oral traditions that carried the explanations of the earthworks across the centuries are taken seriously as the historical and theological documents they are. This is science meeting humanity in the most productive way. The precise, careful, evidence-based work of archaeology being enriched by the interpretive depth of traditions that have been thinking about these places and their meanings for much longer than the archaeology has been asking. And what is emerging from that convergence is a picture of pre-Columbian North America that is so much richer, so much more complex, and so much more impressive than the version that was taught for most of the past 2 centuries, that it requires a fundamental revision of how we think about this continent and its history. Not a simple revision, not a replacement of one simple story with another, but a genuine engagement with complexity, with the fact that what was here before European contact was a world as fully human as any other world, as fully invested with meaning and knowledge and aspiration and achievement, and as fully deserving of the kind of serious, respectful, detailed historical attention that we have given, sometimes lavishly, to the civilizations of the Old World. That attention is being paid, increasingly, by a growing community of researchers who are bringing new tools and new openness to evidence that was always there, but was never fully seen. The seeing is happening slowly, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with the kind of defensiveness that attaches to any revision of deeply held assumptions. But happening. The story that is emerging is extraordinary. Let's keep listening to it. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves serious attention, and it is the one that gets the least serious attention in the mainstream accounts. Not because it is speculative or unsupported, but because it touches on questions that are politically and emotionally charged in ways that make honest discussion difficult. The question of what exactly happened to the various civilizations of pre-Columbian North America, and specifically whether any of the collapses that punctuate the archaeological record might have involved contact with outside populations before the period usually identified as European contact. This is a fraught question. It is fraught because the history of claims about pre-Columbian contact has been so thoroughly contaminated by racist mythology the Mound Builder myth and its various descendants, that any serious discussion of the question tends to get dismissed by association with the worst versions of those claims. And it is fraught because some of the serious versions of the question, the actual archaeological and genetic evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and other parts of the world, touch on issues of indigenous identity and historical narrative that are understandably sensitive. But the evidence is real, and the responsible approach to real evidence is to engage with it honestly, distinguishing carefully between what it shows and what it does not show, between the serious claims and the nonsense that surrounds them. The Norse presence in North America before Columbus is no longer seriously disputed. The Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, is an established fact, confirmed by both archaeology and Norse sagas, dating to around 1000 CE. The Norse were in North America. They interacted with indigenous peoples, the people they called Skraelings, in ways that involved both trade and conflict. They did not establish permanent colonies, as far as the evidence shows, and their presence appears to have been limited in duration and geographic extent, but they were there. The implications of that presence for the broader question of pre-Columbian contact are not entirely clear. The Norse presence in Newfoundland does not automatically mean significant cultural or genetic exchange with the interior of the continent, but it does establish definitively that the Americas were not as isolated from the rest of the world as the pre-Columbus conventional narrative assumed. And the question of what other contacts may have occurred, from what directions, and at what dates, is a legitimate area of investigation that the evidence is actively complicating. Genetic studies of Amazonian populations have identified genetic markers suggesting contact with Australasian populations, specifically populations related to indigenous Australians and Papuans at some point in the pre-Columbian past. This finding, published in peer-reviewed literature and replicated by multiple independent research groups, implies a pattern of transoceanic contact that is not yet explained and that existing models of human migration do not fully account for. These genetic signals do not tell a story of colonization or of civilizational influence. They tell a story of contact, of genetic exchange between populations that were very distant from each other, in a period that the genetic dating places somewhere in the period between 4,000 and 9,000 years ago. How that contact occurred, whether it involved deliberate ocean voyaging or some other mechanism, is not known, but it occurred. There's also the question of what the genetic analysis of ancient North American remains reveals about population history. Ancient DNA analysis, which has revolutionized our understanding of human population history in Europe and Asia, is beginning to produce comparable results for the Americas. And some of those results are surprising. Evidence for multiple distinct lineages in the ancient North American population. Evidence for population replacements and admixtures that complicate the simple single migration picture. Evidence that certain groups may have had complex ancestry that does not fit neatly into existing models. None of this constitutes evidence for the specific theories that the Mound Builder myth and its descendants have proposed. It does not support the idea that the earthworks were built by ancient Israelites or Egyptians or astronauts. What it supports is a picture of the pre-Columbian Americas as a place where human populations have a complex and still not fully understood history of movement, contact, and interaction, both internal and possibly external. That is a different thing from the lost race theories. It is a scientific question being investigated by scientific methods, producing results that require interpretation and that are actively being debated and refined. It is not the place for the kind of confident speculation that the alternative history industry loves to produce. But it is also not the place for the kind of confident dismissal that some mainstream commentary applies to any suggestion of pre-Columbian contact complexity. The evidence is too interesting and too real for that. What the evidence is actually pointing toward, in all of its complexity and its complications and its genuinely uncertain areas, is a picture of the pre-Columbian Americas as a world of enormous human richness and complexity, connected to the rest of the human world in ways that we are still mapping. Home to civilizational achievements that we are still learning to appreciate fully. The heir to a catastrophe so total and so swift that it obscured most of what had existed, leaving the survivors to face the future with a fraction of the knowledge and population and institutional capacity they had before. That world deserves to be known. The people who build it deserve to be recognized. The knowledge they accumulated deserves to be respected. And the story of what happened to them deserves to be told honestly, without the minimizations and the convenient fictions and the misdirection that have characterized so much of the public account. It is being told slowly, imperfectly, with all the complications that honesty requires, but told. And as the telling becomes more complete, as the evidence accumulates and the interpretations deepen and the connections between archaeological fact and oral tradition and genetic history and ecological analysis become clearer, what emerges is not a simple story and not a comfortable one, but a true one, or something closer to true than what came before. And that is what this whole project is about, getting closer to what was actually here, getting closer to who these people actually were, getting closer to the actual scale and sophistication of what they built and what they knew and what they lost. The earthworks are still there. Monk's Mound still rises 100 feet above the Illinois plain. The Serpent Mound still coils across the Ohio landscape. The geometric enclosures at Newark still hold their precise circles and octagons against the encroachment of the modern world. Or at least the parts of them that have not been destroyed by development hold them. The Great North Road of Chaco still runs its 30 miles through the New Mexico desert, visible to LiDAR even where it is invisible to the eye. They are waiting to be fully understood. They are waiting for the kind of sustained, serious, properly resourced attention that would allow the questions they raise to be answered as completely as the evidence allows. They are waiting for a culture that is willing to engage with what they represent honestly, without the minimization and without the wild speculation, but with a combination of scientific rigor and genuine intellectual openness that the evidence deserves. That culture is coming into being, slowly but coming. There are things about this story that keep me up at night, or would keep me up at night if I let them. Not the mysteries, though the mysteries are genuinely compelling. Not even the catastrophe, though the catastrophe is devastating in ways that become more vivid the more clearly you understand what was lost. What keeps my attention in the way that the most important things always do is the gap. The gap between what was here and what the story says was here. The gap between the evidence and the narrative. The gap between what can be known with sufficient care and honesty and willingness to look and what has actually been known by the people with the power and the platform to shape what the rest of us understand. That gap is closing. That is the encouraging part. And I want to dwell on it for a moment before we continue, because the closing of that gap is not accidental and not inevitable and not free. It is the result of work, specific, dedicated, persistent work by specific people. Archaeologists who chose to study sites and questions that were not fashionable. Geneticists who applied new techniques to old problems. Indigenous scholars who brought their community's knowledge into conversation with the scientific literature in ways that enriched both. Writers and filmmakers and teachers who decided that the actual history was more interesting than the comfortable version and said so. The closing of the gap is also the result of the evidence itself, which has a kind of patience that human arguments do not. The earthworks stood through the centuries. The chemical signatures of trade goods, weighted in museum collections for analytical techniques sophisticated enough to read them. The genetic markers sat in the DNA of living populations and ancient remains until the sequencing technology could find them. The astronomical alignments encoded in stone and earth were there for anyone who bothered to measure them precisely enough to see what they encoded. The evidence was always there. What changed was the willingness and the ability to read it honestly. And what that reading reveals, piece by piece, year by year, site by site, is a world that challenges everything we thought we knew about what is possible in pre-Columbian North America. Not in the direction of the lost race theories. Not in the direction of ancient astronauts or Atlantean refugees or the other fantasies that have attached themselves to the genuine mystery. In the direction of human achievement. In the direction of what actual people with actual ingenuity and actual organizational capacity and actual accumulated knowledge can accomplish over the course of several thousand years when conditions are right and the social structure is supported. In the direction of civilization, a real one. Now let's talk about what ended it. Or rather, let us talk about the various things that ended the various phases of it. Because there were multiple endings, not a single catastrophe, and the question of causation is complex in ways that the simplifications of popular history do not capture. The end of the poverty point tradition around 700 BCE is poorly understood. The site was abandoned. The trade networks collapsed. The remarkable organizational experiment that had produced the largest earthworks of its time simply stopped. The reasons are not clear from the archaeological record. Climate disruption is a possibility. The period around 700 BCE saw significant climate changes in many parts of the world. Social stress from within the system is possible. Any complex organization that has been running for several centuries without obvious external pressure can develop internal contradictions that eventually produce collapse. External pressure from other populations is possible, though the evidence for it is thin. What is clear is that the abandonment was relatively rapid by the standards of complex cultural transitions, and that what followed was a period of reduced organizational complexity across the lower Mississippi Valley that lasted several centuries before the Adena, and then the Hopewell traditions began to develop further north. The end of the Hopewell tradition around 400 to 500 CE is somewhat better documented, though still not fully understood. The decline coincides with a period of climate disruption, and there is some evidence for increased conflict. Defensive structures appear at some sites in the later Hopewell period that were not present in the earlier phases. The long-distance trade networks contracted, which would have disrupted the flow of exotic materials that were central to the burial practices and the cosmological system that the material culture expresses. Without access to copper and mica and obsidian and marine shells in the quantities the Hopewell tradition required, the practices that depended on those materials would have had to change. Whether the change in practice preceded or followed the contraction of the trade networks is not entirely clear from the evidence. What is clear is that by around 500 CE, the specific combination of practices and material culture and organizational scale that defined Hopewell was no longer present. Something different, something in certain respects simpler, and in other respects more localized and regionally specific, had taken its place across the eastern woodlands. The relationship between that post-Hopewell period and the subsequent rise of the Mississippian tradition, culminating in Cahokia, is one of the interesting puzzles of Eastern North American prehistory. There are connections, continuities of practice and belief and material culture that suggest a genuine historical thread connecting the traditions across the gap. But there are also substantial differences. Differences in scale and in the specific forms that monumental construction takes and in the nature of the social hierarchy that the burial evidence reveals. The Cahokia collapse, the gradual depopulation of the city between roughly 1150 and 1350 CE, is the best documented of the major endings. Partly because it is the most recent, and partly because the scale of the site and the intensity of archaeological attention have produced a richer evidentiary record. The evidence points toward multiple contributing factors. Environmental stress is well documented. Pollen records and soil chemistry from the area around Cahokia show evidence of significant deforestation and soil erosion from the intensive agriculture and wood harvesting that supported the city's population. The depletion of local resources would have made the city increasingly dependent on imports from hinterland, and the political structures that maintained those imports would have had to work harder to sustain the flow. Climatic disruption is another factor. The medieval warm period, which had created favorable conditions for agriculture in much of North America, and may have contributed to Cahokia's rapid growth, was giving way by the late 12th and early 13th centuries to a period of increased climatic instability that included both severe droughts and significant flood events. Flood deposits at Cahokia itself show evidence of major flooding events during the period of the city's decline, events that would have been catastrophic for a low-lying settlement in a floodplain. Political stress is suggested by the defensive palisades that appear around the central area in the later period of Cahokia's occupation. Whoever was in charge felt threatened enough to invest substantial resources in defensive construction, which implies either internal conflict between different factions within Cahokian society or external threats from neighboring populations who were themselves under stress from the same environmental and climatic pressures. And there is the possibility, not yet proven, but not unreasonable given what we know about the nature of chiefdom societies and their characteristic instabilities, of political collapse from within. The failure of the redistributive system that held the city together. The withdrawal of the hinterland populations who had been supplying it with food and labor. The erosion of the ideological foundations that had given the Cahokian elite its authority. Any one of these factors might have been manageable. The combination, playing out over 2 or 3 generations, was not. The city that had been the center of a continental system became, relatively quickly in historical terms, an empty landscape with earthen monuments. What happened to the people is one of the questions that the archaeological record has not fully answered. The population that Cahokia supported at its peak, estimated at tens of thousands in the central area and perhaps 100,000 in the surrounding region, did not simply disappear. It dispersed, moved to smaller sites across the region, maintained elements of the Mississippian cultural tradition in reduced and modified forms, continued to build platform mounds and practice some version of the cosmological and political systems that Cahokia had developed. But the specific organizational capacity that had built Cahokia and maintained it as a functioning urban center for several centuries was not reconstituted. The city remained empty. The mounds remained standing. The knowledge that had produced them became, over the following centuries of dispersal and demographic collapse and European contact, fragmented, attenuated, and partially lost. The catastrophe of European contact, beginning with the initial disease exposure in the late 15th and early 16th centuries and accelerating through the subsequent centuries of colonization, completed a process that was already underway. Populations that had been declining from environmental stress and political disruption were hit with epidemics that reduced them by 90% in a century or less. Knowledge that had been maintained in specialist traditions was disrupted by the deaths of the specialists. Political structures that had survived the Cahokian collapse in reduced form were further disrupted by the pressures of European contact. The slave raids, the trade disruptions, the deliberate programs of cultural destruction that characterized much of the colonial project. What survived is remarkable given the scale of what happened. The languages, many of them, the ceremonies, adapted and sometimes hidden but surviving. The knowledge of plants and water and seasonal cycles and ecological relationships, preserved in practices that continued even when the explanations that surrounded them were suppressed. The stories transformed by the pressures of survival, but retaining threads of historical memory that connect the present to the pre-contact past. And the earthworks, still standing, mostly still there, still encoding in their forms and their alignments and their spatial relationships, the astronomical knowledge and the cosmological beliefs and the organizational achievements of the people who built them, waiting to be read. Some of them will not wait much longer. Development pressure on archaeological sites across the eastern United States has been destroying earthworks for 2 centuries, and the rate of loss has not decreased significantly despite the best efforts of preservation advocates and archaeologists and indigenous communities who understand what is being lost. Sites that Squire and Davis documented in the 1840s no longer exist. Sites that were visible from aerial photography in the 1960s have been plowed under or built over. Every year, some portion of the record is permanently erased. The urgency that the preservation situation creates is itself a kind of argument for the importance of this story. The evidence is finite and diminishing. The window for understanding it is closing, not because the interest is declining, but because the physical record is being reduced. Every site that is preserved is a site that the future can continue to learn from. Every site that is destroyed takes with it knowledge that cannot be recovered. This is not an abstract concern. It is a concrete and immediate problem that the archaeological community and the indigenous communities who are the primary stakeholders in this heritage are wrestling with every day. The solution involves not just legal protection for known sites, which is imperfect and unevenly enforced, but the much more difficult work of changing the public understanding of what these sites are and why they matter. Because ultimately the protection of the earthworks depends on a public that understands their significance, and a public that has been told for 2 centuries that pre-Columbian North America contained nothing worth protecting except some primitive tools and some bones is not well equipped to make the decisions that preservation requires. That is another reason why this story matters. Not just as history, not just as archaeology, but as the foundation for the kind of informed public engagement that the preservation of this heritage requires. People who understand what the earthworks represent, who understand the astronomical sophistication and the engineering achievement and the long-distance trade networks and the cosmological complexity that they embody, are people who can make a rational argument for their preservation. People who have been told that the pre-Columbian past was essentially empty and unimpressive are people who will not fight for what they do not know they have lost. The story matters. The telling of it matters. And the honest telling of it, without minimization and without the wild speculation that discredits genuine investigation, matters most of all. Let us keep going because there is more, and the more is important. The question of medicine is one that does not come up often enough in discussions of pre-Columbian North American civilization. And that is a significant omission, because the medical knowledge accumulated by the peoples of pre-Columbian North America represents one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements in the tradition, and its fate in the aftermath of European contact is one of the most significant losses in the history of human knowledge. The pharmacological knowledge alone is staggering. Over the course of several thousand years of systematic observation and experimentation, the indigenous peoples of North America developed a comprehensive understanding of the medicinal properties of the plants of their environments. Not folk remedies in the dismissive sense that term sometimes carries, but specific, reproducible, effective treatments for specific conditions, developed through the kind of careful observation and testing that constitutes genuine pharmacological research, even if it does not look like a modern clinical trial. The active compounds in willow bark that reduce fever and relieve pain are the same compounds that form the basis of aspirin. The indigenous knowledge of willow bark as a medicinal plant predates the isolation of salicylic acid by European chemists by thousands of years. The knowledge of the medicinal properties of echinacea, now one of the most widely used herbal supplements in the world, came from indigenous North American traditions that had identified its immune-stimulating properties through long experience. The specific plants used as antiseptics and wound treatments in various indigenous traditions have been found in modern analysis to contain actual antimicrobial compounds that justify their traditional uses. This is not coincidence. This is knowledge, real knowledge that was accumulated through genuine investigation of the natural world and refined through generations of application and observation. And the loss of much of this knowledge through the deaths of the specialists who held it and the suppression of the cultural traditions that transmitted it represents a genuine and substantial reduction in humanity's total medical knowledge base. Modern pharmaceutical research has been working slowly and incompletely to recover some of this knowledge by investigating plants that were used medically in traditional contexts. The results, when researchers have bothered to look, have been remarkably productive. A significant proportion of modern pharmaceuticals are derived from or based on compounds first identified in traditional medical systems. And the proportion would be much higher if the research had been more systematic and the traditional knowledge had been more completely preserved. The ethnobotanical recovery efforts that are happening now, the documentation of traditional plant knowledge in collaboration with indigenous communities that still hold fragments of it, are among the most valuable scientific projects of the current era. And the urgency of those efforts is acute because the elders who hold the knowledge are aging, and without sustained documentation, the knowledge will be lost permanently. This is not nostalgia. This is practical. The plants are still there. The compounds are still in them. The knowledge of how to use them effectively is what is being lost. And recovering it through reinvestigation from scratch will take decades and billions of dollars that direct documentation could save. The pre-Columbian North American tradition had knowledge of the natural world that in some domains exceeds what modern science has yet recovered. That is a statement about the depth and the duration of the tradition, not about the inferiority of modern science. Modern science has enormous capabilities that traditional knowledge does not, but has not been around for as long. And in certain specific domains of long-term observation and accumulated empirical knowledge, the traditional systems have a depth that modern science is still working to match. Ecological knowledge, astronomical observation, medicinal plant knowledge, agricultural practice. These are the domains where the pre-Columbian tradition was most deeply developed. And these are the domains where the losses have been most significant and most costly, not just to the indigenous communities who lost the knowledge, but to the broader human community that would have benefited from its continuation and development. The loss of this knowledge is the least visible and most permanent consequence of the colonization of the Americas. Populations can recover from demographic catastrophe given enough time and given conditions that support recovery. Cultures can rebuild, adapt, find new forms while maintaining connections to the past. Languages can be revitalized from documentation and community effort. But knowledge that was held entirely in living minds and transmitted entirely through personal apprenticeship, knowledge that left no written record and no physical artifact, is simply gone when the people who held it die without passing it on. Some of it was passed on, Not enough, but some. And that some is being documented and preserved, and in some cases revitalized with an urgency and a depth of commitment that reflects the understanding of what is at stake. The pre-Columbian world was a world of knowledge. The earthworks encode astronomical knowledge. The trade networks encode geographic and social knowledge. The agricultural practices encode ecological knowledge. The ceramic traditions encode material knowledge. The oral traditions encode historical and cosmological knowledge. This was a knowledge civilization, organized in ways that looked different from the knowledge systems of literate old world civilizations, but that were no less real and no less valuable. That knowledge was not lost entirely, but the portion of it that was lost in the catastrophe of colonization, represents one of the great intellectual tragedies of human history. Let us come back to the fear. Let us sit with it a little longer, because it is important and because it has not been fully explained. The fear the early colonists felt when they encountered the earthworks of North America was not just the fear of the unknown. It was not just the discomfort of encountering something that did not fit the available categories. It was something more specific, more targeted, and ultimately more revealing about the psychological dynamics of colonization. When Thomas Jefferson directed the first systematic archaeological investigation of a burial mound in Virginia in the 1780s, he was doing something genuinely unusual for his time, applying the methods of empirical investigation to a site that most of his contemporaries treated as something to be explained away rather than understood. His excavation, described in his notes on the state of Virginia, is considered by many archaeologists to be the first scientifically conducted archaeological investigation in American history. Jefferson was genuinely curious. He wanted to know who had built the mound and when, and he approached the question with the empirical rigor that his scientific commitments required. What he found was evidence for multiple burials at different levels, suggesting that the mound had been used over an extended period, not built for a single individual. He found no evidence for the kind of elaborate grave goods that later excavations of Hopewell and Mississippian sites would reveal, but the careful layering of burials was clear, and he interpreted it correctly as evidence for deliberate, repeated use of the mound for mortuary purposes over time. Jefferson's investigation was exceptional for its honesty and its rigor, but his broader conclusions about the mounds and their builders were shaped by the intellectual framework of his time, a framework that had difficulty allowing for the possibility that the people living near the mounds in his day were the descendants of the people who had built them. The mound builder myth, which Jefferson did not explicitly endorse but also did not effectively challenge, was already establishing itself as the default explanation for the impressive earthworks, precisely because the alternative, acknowledging that the indigenous peoples of North America had built them, complicated the narrative that colonization required. That narrative needed the land to have been effectively empty or inhabited only by people too primitive to have any real claim to it. The earthworks complicated that narrative. The more impressive the earthworks, the more they complicated it. And the mound builder myth solved the complication by simply removing the earthworks from the relevant history. They were built by someone else, someone who was gone, someone whose disappearance was the responsibility of the actual inhabitants and not of the Europeans who were now taking the land. This is the political logic of the myth, and it is nakedly transparent once you see it. The mound builder myth did not arise from honest puzzlement about the origins of the earthworks. It arose from the political need to separate the earthworks from the living people who were their actual descendants. The puzzlement was constructed after the fact to justify a conclusion that had been reached for political reasons. Jefferson himself, for all his intellectual honesty about the specific archaeological evidence, was deeply embedded in the political and economic system that required indigenous dispossession. He owned slaves. He benefited from a social order that depended on the denial of full humanity to specific categories of people. His intellectual life was complicated by his political life in ways that he never fully resolved. And the question of who built the mounds was one place where those complications were visible. The colonists' fear of the earthworks was also, I think, a form of guilt recognition. Not acknowledged guilt, not explicit guilt, but the discomfort of encountering evidence that contradicted the story they needed to believe about what they were doing. The earthworks said people were here. People who built complex things. People who knew things worth knowing. People whose civilization had as much right to the land it shaped as any civilization anywhere. That was uncomfortable. That was frightening. That was something that needed to be managed. The management took the form of denial, of minimization, of the mound builder myth and its descendants. And it has been remarkably successful by the standards of historical denial. Most people in the United States today, more than 2 centuries after Jefferson's excavation, are substantially unaware of the scale and sophistication of the pre-Columbian civilizational tradition in their own backyard. The ignorance is maintained by a combination of factors that are themselves revealing. The curriculum decisions that keep pre-Columbian North American history at the margins of what is taught in schools, focusing instead on the period beginning with European contact. The framing of what comes before contact as prehistory, a term that technically just means before written records, but that in practice often carries the implication of before real history, before anything that really counts. The physical absence from most public spaces of the kind of monumental reminders of the pre-Columbian past that are present in other parts of the world. The standing pyramids of Egypt, the ruins of Rome, the great walls and temples of Asia. The earthworks of North America are genuinely impressive, but many of them have been destroyed, and the ones that remain are not, for the most part, widely known or prominently presented in the public culture. Monk's Mound is accessible to the public and is a state historic site, but it is not the kind of iconic landmark that draws millions of visitors the way comparable ancient monuments do in other parts of the world. The Newark earthworks survive partially, but significant portions of the complex were built over in the 19th century for a golf course and a county fairground, and the remaining portions are not as prominent in the public consciousness as they would be if they were, say, in Europe. The physical marginalization of the earthworks mirrors the intellectual marginalization of the civilization that built them. Both reflect the same underlying dynamic. The political need to minimize the pre-Columbian past to avoid the implications that a full acknowledgement of it would have for the history of colonization. Those implications are not comfortable, but they are not as threatening as the minimization pretends. Acknowledging that the people who were displaced by colonization had built remarkable civilizations does not invalidate the existence or the achievements of the societies that displaced them. It does not require that anything be undone that cannot be undone. It does not demand the impossible. It demands only the honest engagement with historical fact that should be a minimum requirement of any civilized society's relationship to its own past. That engagement is happening slowly and with resistance, but happening. The growing recognition of the sophistication of pre-Columbian North American civilization is part of a broader reckoning with a history of colonization that is still incomplete and still contested, but unmistakably underway. It is happening in academic archaeology, in the growing collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities, in the public attention to indigenous heritage and knowledge, in the legal and political frameworks that are beginning to give indigenous communities more say in the management and interpretation of sites that are their ancestral heritage. It is happening in the growing recognition that the stories indigenous peoples tell about their own histories are not simply mythology to be decoded, but are historical accounts deserving of serious engagement. It is happening in the renewed interest in traditional ecological knowledge as a resource for contemporary land management challenges. It is happening in the museums that are rethinking how they present pre-Columbian collections and the stories those collections tell. It is happening in conversations like this one, in the growing public curiosity about the actual history of the Americas. A curiosity that is not satisfied by the comfortable minimizations of the past, and that is finding, when it looks seriously at the evidence, a story much richer and more complex and more impressive than it expected. That is the most hopeful thing about this moment. The curiosity is there. The evidence is there. The tools to read the evidence are there and getting better every year. The communities that hold the living connections to the pre-Columbian traditions are there and are increasingly asserting their role as interpreters of a heritage that belongs to them. The story can be told honestly. It is being told, and the honest version, with all its complexity and all its tragedy and all its genuine achievement, is so much more interesting and so much more important than the version that replaced it that the replacement is increasingly hard to sustain. We are in the middle of a historical revision that has been building for decades and is now accelerating. The revision involves not just the specific facts of pre-Columbian North American history, but the broader framework within which that history is understood. The assumptions about what counts as civilization, what counts as knowledge, what counts as achievement, and whose story counts as history. Those assumptions are changing. They are changing because the evidence demands it, because the communities whose history is at stake are demanding it, and because the intellectual frameworks that minimized and distorted the record are increasingly exposed as inadequate to the evidence they were supposed to explain. The revision is not complete. It will not be complete for a long time, if ever, because history is never finished. There will always be new evidence, new analyses, new perspectives that add to and complicate and revise what was thought to be known. That is the nature of the enterprise. But the direction of the revision is clear. The pre-Columbian North American past is not the simple, thinly populated, organizationally primitive world that the minimizing narrative described. It is a complex, richly inhabited, organizationally sophisticated, astronomically and agriculturally and medically knowledgeable world that deserves the serious historical attention that the honest version of this story gives it. And that world is being recovered piece by piece, site by site, analysis by analysis, tradition by tradition, being recovered and brought into the public understanding where it belongs. Let me tell you about a specific moment in that recovery, because specific moments have a power that abstractions do not. In 1987, a developer in Newark, Ohio, was preparing to expand a golf course that had been built on portions of the Newark earthworks in the 1930s. The expansion would have destroyed additional portions of the ancient complex. A coalition of archaeologists and preservationists and members of the Ohio Shawnee people organized to stop the expansion and began advocating for the purchase and preservation of the remaining earthwork portions. The advocacy was successful, eventually in part. The Great Circle and the Octagon are now state memorials, protected from development. The golf course still operates on a portion of the earthwork complex, a situation that has generated ongoing controversy and that is slowly being resolved in favor of more complete archaeological access. The process has been slow and the outcomes incomplete, but the earthworks are there and the advocacy continues, and the people who are fighting for their preservation understand what they are fighting for. Not just a historical curiosity, but a living connection to a tradition that is the heritage of the indigenous communities whose ancestors built them, and the broader heritage of everyone who lives in the country that was built on and over. And through that tradition, that is what this story is ultimately about. Not just the mounds and the earthworks, though they are remarkable. Not just the astronomical knowledge and the trade networks and the ecological sophistication, though they are impressive. It is about the human world that produced all of these things. The actual people who lived and worked and built and thought and organized and traded and observed and remembered and transmitted. They were real. Their achievements were real. Their descendants are real and present and still connected to the traditions that the earthworks represent. And the story of who they were and what they built and what happened to them and what survived is one of the great untold stories of the country that was built on top of what they left behind. It is being told now, imperfectly, incompletely, with all the limitations that any honest engagement with a complex and contested history must have, but told. And every time it is told honestly, with the evidence and without the convenient fictions, it gets a little more complete, a little closer to what was actually here. That is what this has been about. Not a final answer, because there is no final answer to questions this deep and this complex, but a closer look at the actual evidence and the actual story it tells. A closer look at the civilization that was here before the civilization that replaced it. The civilization that built earthworks visible from miles away and aligned them to the cycles of the moon and the sun with an accuracy that still impresses modern engineers. The civilization that traded copper and shells and obsidian across a continent and maintained those networks for centuries and encoded its cosmological beliefs in the materials and the forms and the spatial arrangements that the archaeological record preserves. The civilization that terrified the early colonists, not because it was threatening in any immediate physical sense, but because it was there. It was real. It was impressive. And its reality and its impressiveness made the story that colonization required. The story of empty land and primitive peoples. Harder to tell. That story was told anyway for 2 centuries. But the evidence of the civilization that was here before did not go away. It sat in the ground and in the soil chemistry and in the astronomical alignments and in the oral traditions of the people who survived, and it waited. It is still waiting for the full acknowledgement it deserves. This is the beginning of that acknowledgement. There is a detail about the Great Hopewell Road that tends to stop people when they hear it for the first time. The road, or more precisely the trace of what researchers believe was a road, runs between the Newark earthworks and the Hopewell earthwork complexes near Chillicothe, Ohio, a distance of roughly 60 miles as the crow flies. The trace, visible in aerial photography and confirmed in segments by ground survey, is a broad, straight path through the landscape bordered by low earthen walls, running with the kind of directness that does not happen by accident or by the gradual accumulation of foot traffic. 60 miles connected by a deliberately constructed path. The distance between the 2 sites is significant because the Newark and Chillicothe complexes are the 2 largest and most elaborate Hopewell earthwork sites known. If they were connected by a road, that connection was almost certainly not incidental. It suggests relationship, coordination, perhaps governance, or at least regular formal contact between 2 centers that together dominated the Hopewell interaction sphere. The road has not been fully confirmed by excavation. It is, to be precise, a research hypothesis supported by evidence that is suggestive but not definitive. Some researchers accept it as established. Others are more cautious. The debate is a genuine scientific one, and honest engagement with it requires acknowledging the uncertainty. But the suggestive evidence is interesting enough to take seriously. And the hypothesis it supports, that the major Hopewell sites were connected by constructed pathways reflecting a level of political and economic organization that went beyond what scattered independent communities would require, fits with the broader picture of Hopewell that the other evidence supports. The Hopewell tradition was not a collection of independent local cultures that happened to share some stylistic elements. The consistency of the geometric earthwork traditions, the consistency of the burial practices, the consistency of the material culture, and the extraordinary reach of the trade networks all point towards something more organized, more coordinated, more deliberately maintained across space and time than a simple shared aesthetic tradition. Whatever that organizational structure was, it was capable of maintaining consistent practices and material standards across hundreds of miles and several centuries. That is an organizational achievement that requires infrastructure, communication systems, relationship maintenance, mechanisms for the transmission of knowledge and standards and materials across the geographic extent of the tradition. Roads, or at least formal pathways, would have been part of that infrastructure. The Great Hopewell Road, if it is confirmed, would be one piece of evidence for the kind of physical infrastructure that the organizational achievement implies. The relationship between Hopewell and Cahokia is one of the most interesting questions in Eastern North American archaeology. They are separated by several centuries. The Hopewell decline at around 400 to 500 CE and the Cahokia fluorescence beginning at around 700 to 800 CE, and they're separated in geography, with Hopewell centered in Ohio and Cahokia in the central Mississippi Valley. But the connections between them are real. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the Hopewell earthworks appears in transformed but recognizable form in the Cahokian wood hinges and the spatial organization of the Cahokia site. The emphasis on platform mounds as locations for elite or ceremonial activity, present in later Hopewell contexts, is the central architectural principle of the Mississippian tradition that Cahokia exemplifies. The trade networks of Hopewell, disrupted in the period of the Hopewell decline, were reconstituted in modified form in the Mississippian period and still centered in the same general geographic area. These connections suggest that the knowledge and the organizational models, and possibly some of the specific lineages that produce Hopewell, were preserved through the period of apparent simplification that followed its decline, maintained in forms that are less archaeologically visible, but that provided the foundation from which the Mississippian tradition culminating in Cahokia developed. This is a recurring theme in the archaeology of Eastern North America. The persistence of knowledge and organizational capacity through periods of apparent simplification. The maintenance of traditions in reduced or transformed forms that allow them to become the foundation of new complexities when conditions permit. The tradition is not continuous in the visible monumental sense. There are gaps, periods when the major constructions are absent and the organizational scale is reduced. But something persists through those gaps, some thread of continuity that connects the later developments to what came before. That thread is often most visible in the astronomical knowledge. The lunar standstill cycle encoded at Newark appears in somewhat different but recognizable form in the later Mississippian tradition. Solar alignments in Hopewell contexts appear in Cahokian wood hinges. The orientation of major earthworks to the cardinal directions present in Hopewell is central to the Mississippian tradition. Astronomical knowledge of this specificity and precision is not independently reinvented every generation. It is transmitted. The transmission implies institutional structures. Even if those structures are not archaeologically visible, structures capable of maintaining specific, precise knowledge across the gaps in the monumental record. The knowledge was there. The tradition was there. What varied across the centuries and the various cycles of complexity and simplification was the social and political context that allowed the tradition to express itself in monumental form. When the conditions were right, when the population was sufficient and the organizational capacity was adequate and the resources were available, the tradition expressed itself in earthworks. When the conditions were disrupted, the tradition maintained itself in reduced form, waiting for conditions to improve. And when conditions improved, it expressed itself again, building on what had been preserved through the difficult period, extending and elaborating and transforming the knowledge into new forms appropriate to the new context. This is what traditions do. This is what the accumulated knowledge and practice of a civilization does when it encounters disruption. It contracts to its most essential forms, preserves what it can, and expands again when expansion is possible. The Hopewell tradition contracted. The knowledge was preserved. Cahokia expanded from what was preserved. And when Cahokia contracted, something was preserved again, enough to maintain the thread of the tradition through the catastrophe of European contact. Not enough. Too little survived the 90% demographic catastrophe, the deliberate suppression of cultural practices, the disruption of the apprenticeship systems that transmitted specialist knowledge. But not nothing. The thread is thin in places, almost invisible. But it runs from the present back to poverty point, and through every cycle of complexity and contraction in between. The people who are the descendants of all of this, the Native American communities of Eastern North America, are not simply the survivors of colonization. They are the carriers of a tradition that runs back 5,000 years or more. They are the living connection to a civilization that built earthworks visible from miles away and aligned them to the stars and traded copper across a continent. That connection is not always easy to maintain, not always fully articulate about its own depth, not always presented in the ways that match the expectations of outside observers who are looking for something that looks like the visible monuments of old world civilizations. But it is real. It persists in the ceremonies that mark the seasons, in the stories that encode historical memory, in the relationships to specific places that carry the accumulated meaning of centuries of habitation and observation and practice. And it is increasingly being asserted not as a historical curiosity or a political gesture, but as a living reality that has something to contribute to the ongoing conversation about how human beings should live on this continent and in this world. The pre-Columbian tradition of North America had answers to some of the most pressing questions of the contemporary moment. How to manage landscapes sustainably over long time periods. How to maintain human communities in ways that do not deplete the resources they depend on. How to integrate astronomical and ecological knowledge into the practical systems of daily life in ways that maintain the connections between human culture and the natural world. Those answers are not simple, and they are not directly applicable to contemporary conditions without substantial translation. The world has changed too much for a simple imitation to work. But the principles underlying the answers, the attention to long-term sustainability, the integration of ecological knowledge into decision-making, the recognition that human communities exist within and depend on natural systems rather than standing apart from and above them. Those principles are as relevant as they have ever been. More relevant, perhaps, because the consequences of ignoring them are becoming increasingly visible, increasingly urgent, increasingly impossible to manage through the kind of short-term technological fixes that the modern tradition has relied on. The pre-Columbian North American tradition does not have all the answers. No tradition does, but it has been asking the right questions for a very long time. And the asking itself is instructive. The questions about how to live sustainably in this specific landscape, with its specific cycles and its specific resources and its specific vulnerabilities, were being asked and partially answered by the people who lived here for thousands of years before the current regime of land use began. The partial answers that were developed over those thousands of years of observation and practice represent a body of knowledge that the current regime of land use has barely begun to draw on. That is a loss that can be partially recovered if the will and the resources and the respect for the tradition that holds the knowledge are brought to bear in time. But recovery requires recognition. And recognition begins with the honest telling of the story of what was here and what was built and what was known and what was lost. That is what this has been. There is something I want to come back to before we move toward the end of this particular telling. And it is the question of the stars. Because the astronomical knowledge of pre-Columbian North America is not just impressive as an engineering achievement. It is revealing as a window into a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the cosmos that is genuinely different from the modern scientific framework. Different in ways that are interesting and worth thinking about. The people who built the Newark earthworks and encoded the lunar standstill cycle in their geometry were not simply measuring the sky for practical reasons. Though there were practical reasons for astronomical knowledge, they were engaging with the sky as a living system, as a set of beings and relationships with which human beings were in ongoing relationship, not simply as a mechanical backdrop to human activity. This is the animist worldview that we discussed briefly earlier. The understanding of the natural world as composed of persons and relationships rather than objects and forces. And it shaped the astronomical observation and the earthwork construction in ways that are visible in the archaeological record, even when the specific beliefs that animated them are not. The orientation of earthworks to celestial events was not simply a matter of practical timekeeping, though that was part of it. It was a matter of alignment, of placing human constructions in appropriate relationship to the larger cosmic order that gave them meaning. The earthworks were not just buildings. They were statements of relationship, declarations that the community that built them understood its place in the larger pattern of existence and was choosing to make that understanding visible in the landscape. This is a different relationship to the cosmos than the one that modern science embodies. Not necessarily wrong, not necessarily right. Different in ways that reflect different assumptions about what the cosmos is and what human beings are and what the relationship between them should be. The modern scientific framework understands the cosmos as a set of physical processes governed by natural laws that operate without regard to human presence or human meaning. Human beings are part of the cosmos, but not in any privileged relationship to it. We are one species among many living on one planet, among billions in one galaxy, among hundreds of billions. The cosmos does not care about us. The animist framework that produced the earthworks understood the cosmos differently, as a web of relationships in which human beings participate, in which the movements of celestial bodies are not indifferent processes, but expressions of living relationships that human beings can observe and respond to and align themselves with. The cosmos, in this framework, is not indifferent. It is aware in some sense of what happens within it, and human beings have responsibilities within that awareness. Neither of these frameworks is provable in the way that specific empirical claims about the world are provable. Both are frameworks for making sense of existence, ways of organizing experience and knowledge and behavior in response to the fundamental facts of being alive and conscious in a universe whose ultimate nature is not fully transparent to any of us. The animist framework produced the earthworks. It produced the astronomical knowledge encoded in them. It produced the trade networks through which sacred materials moved and the ceremonies that gave those materials their meaning, and the oral traditions that preserve the cosmological understanding that connected all of it together. The modern scientific framework has produced extraordinary things too, including the analytical tools that allow us to read what the earthworks were saying. But it has not produced the specific kind of long-term, integrated, attentive relationship to the natural world that the pre-Columbian tradition embodied at its best. The relationship that maintained the eastern forests and managed the Great Plains grasslands and preserved the specific ecological communities that the continent supported for thousands of years. That is not a criticism of modern science. Modern science is not designed to produce that kind of relationship. It is designed to produce knowledge of a specific kind, and it does that extraordinarily well. But the specific kind of knowledge it produces is not the only kind of knowledge that human beings need. And the specific orientation to the natural world that it embodies is not the only orientation that human societies have found valuable. The pre-Columbian tradition had knowledge that modern science does not have and cannot easily reproduce. Modern science has knowledge and capabilities that the pre-Columbian tradition did not have and could not have anticipated. The interesting question is not which one is better, but how they can be brought into productive conversation. That conversation is beginning in the spaces where indigenous knowledge holders and contemporary scientists are beginning to work together with genuine respect for what each brings to the table. It is happening in ecology and in land management and in medicine and in the slow, careful work of recovering traditional knowledge through documentation and analysis. It is happening in the growing recognition within the scientific community that the kind of long-term, systematic, place-specific knowledge that traditional ecological knowledge represents is something that scientific institutions cannot easily replicate and should not try to replace. It is a conversation that should have begun much earlier. The knowledge was being offered for centuries by communities that had it and were willing to share it. The offer was refused repeatedly by a colonial system that could not see what was being offered because it had decided in advance that the people offering it had nothing of value to share. That refusal is one of the great self-inflicted wounds of modern civilization. The cost of it is still being paid in lost knowledge, in degraded landscapes, in the specific ecological and agricultural failures that might have been prevented if the available knowledge had been used. The cost can be partially reduced going forward if the conversation that should have happened earlier is allowed to happen now. But it requires the kind of genuine respect and genuine openness that the colonial system denied, and that the recovery of the honest history of pre-Columbian North America makes both necessary and possible. That is why this story matters, not just as history, as the foundation for a different kind of relationship to the past and to the knowledge it contains. A relationship based on honest acknowledgement of what was here and what was achieved and what was lost and what survived. A relationship that makes possible the kind of conversation that might help us learn what we need to learn. We need to learn from the people who lived sustainably on this continent for thousands of years. We need to learn from the knowledge they accumulated and the practices they developed and the understanding they achieved through long observation and careful attention. We need to approach that learning with the humility that honest acknowledgement of the tradition's depth and sophistication requires. And we need to start by getting the history right, by acknowledging what was here, by telling the story honestly, in full, without the minimizations and the convenient fictions that have characterized so much of the public account. This has been an attempt to do that. It has been incomplete, as any attempt to tell such a complex story must be. There are sites we have not discussed, and dimensions we have not explored, and specific traditions we have not given the attention they deserve. The full story would take much longer than this to tell, and even then it would be incomplete because new evidence is being generated constantly and our understanding is always partial. But this is a beginning, a closer look at the actual evidence and the actual story it tells. A closer engagement with the civilization that was here before the civilization that replaced it, and with the people who are the living connection to that tradition. They were remarkable people. What they built was remarkable. What they knew was remarkable. And the story of what happened to them and what survived deserves to be told with the honesty and the seriousness that remarkable things deserve. The mounds of the Southeast tell their own chapter of this story, and it is one that connects directly to what the earliest Spanish explorers reported when they pushed inland from the Florida coast in the 16th century. The platform mounds of the Mississippian tradition, which spread from the Cahokian heartland across the entire Southeast and into parts of the Northeast, were not ancient ruins when De Soto encountered them. They were functioning centers of active political and ceremonial life, topped with temples and elite residences, surrounded by the plazas, ball courts, and neighborhoods of living towns. Etowah in present-day Georgia was one of those functioning centers. The main mound at Etowah, rising nearly 60 feet above the surrounding ground, was the platform for a temple and the residence of the paramount chief, whose authority extended across a substantial surrounding territory. The burials found beneath the mound contain objects of extraordinary quality. Copper plates embossed with images of supernatural beings and ritual performers, shell gorgets with intricate imagery, stone effigy pipes carved with a skill that reflects a long craft tradition, and objects of materials that came from hundreds of miles away. Etowah was a regional center connected to the broader Mississippian world through the same kinds of trade networks and political relationships that connected Cahokia to its hinterland and that the Hopewell tradition had maintained before that. It was real. It was active. It was inhabited by real people conducting real political and ceremonial life. And it was visited by De Soto's expedition, which passed through the region in 1540. The accounts of that passage are revealing, both for what they tell us about the nature of southeastern Mississippian society at that moment, and for what they tell us about the encounter between that society and European intrusion. De Soto's expedition did not encounter a scattered or disorganized population. It encountered organized chiefdoms with clear hierarchies of authority, with redistribution systems capable of feeding an army of several hundred men for extended periods, with military capabilities sufficient to make the Spaniards treat them cautiously, and with political sophistication sufficient to engage in the kind of complex diplomacy that De Soto required to move through their territories without constant warfare. The accounts describe a Southeast that was thoroughly political, thoroughly organized, thoroughly inhabited at densities that reflect the intensive agricultural systems and the long-established political structures of the Mississippian tradition. The Coosa Paramount Chiefdom, which controlled a substantial area of what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, was capable of projecting political authority over a territory larger than many European kingdoms of the same period. This is the world that was here in 1540. This is the level of complexity and organization that the evidence requires us to acknowledge. Not primitive, not simple, not the empty wilderness that mythology constructed in its place. The wilderness came later, as a consequence of the catastrophe that the De Soto expedition itself helped to initiate. Because De Soto's men carried European diseases, and wherever they went, they left behind them the beginning of epidemics that would spread far faster than the news of their passage. By the time English settlers arrived in the same region a century later, much of what De Soto had described was gone. Not all of it, not everywhere, but enough that the landscape the English encountered bore little resemblance to the landscape the Spanish had moved through. the reduction in population, the collapse of the political structures that depended on those populations, the abandonment of many of the major mound centers. All of this had happened in the intervening century. The wilderness that the English settlers imagined they were entering was the aftermath of this collapse. And the simple, scattered populations they encountered, while still possessing real cultural sophistication and real connections to their pre-contact traditions, were a fraction of what had existed when the civilization was intact. There's a place in West Virginia where the ground holds a secret that has been sitting in plain sight for more than a century without being fully understood. The Grave Creek Mound, located in Moundsville, is one of the largest conical burial mounds in North America. Rising roughly 70 feet above the surrounding terrain and covering an area several hundred feet in diameter at its base. It was built by the Adena people somewhere between 250 and 150 BCE, which makes it roughly contemporary with the later phases of the Hopewell tradition in Ohio and with the first flowering of complex social organization in the region. Inside the mound, excavated in the 1830s in one of the earliest major archaeological investigations in American history, were found the remains of multiple individuals buried in elaborate fashion, including a sandstone tablet with an inscription that has been one of the most debated artifacts in North American archaeology ever since. The Grave Creek Stone, as it is called, bears an inscription of some 45 characters that have been interpreted over the nearly 2 centuries since their discovery as ancient Phoenician, as ancient Celtic, as ancient Greek, as a form of cuneiform, and as a forgery. The interpretations have run the gamut from the scholarly to the frankly absurd, and the artifact itself has been the subject of accusations and counter-accusations of fraud that have still not been definitively resolved. This is the kind of artifact that the alternative history industry loves, and the response of the mainstream archaeological community has been to dismiss it and move on, which is understandable given the quality of most of the alternative interpretations, but is not entirely satisfying as a scientific response. The artifact exists. The inscription exists. Whether it is ancient or modern, genuine or forged, its existence is a fact that deserves honest engagement rather than dismissal. The most likely explanation, by the consensus of the archaeological community, is that the stone is a 19th century forgery produced to attract attention and tourists to the site at a time when the mounds were a major subject of public curiosity. The inscription does not match any known ancient writing system in a way that holds up to serious linguistic analysis, and the circumstances of its discovery involve enough irregularity to raise legitimate questions about its provenance. But the episode is revealing about the dynamics of the broader question, because the eagerness with which the stone was initially accepted as evidence of Old World contact, the willingness of scholars and amateurs alike to see in a set of ambiguous marks the confirmation of ancient Phoenician or Celtic or Israelite presence in North America, tells us something about the power and the persistence of the desire to attribute the earthworks to someone other than their actual builders. The desire persists because the mound builder myth, even after its official debunking in 1894, never entirely died. It went underground, into the realm of popular speculation and religious tradition, where it continues to shape the understanding of pre-Columbian North America for a significant portion of the public. The Mormon tradition, to take the most prominent example, includes as part of its theological framework a narrative of ancient peoples in the Americas that was articulated in the Book of Mormon in 1830, the same decade that the major mound excavations were beginning. The Book of Mormon's narrative of ancient civilizations in the Americas was shaped in part by the mound builder mythology of its time, and it has been interpreted by some readers as providing a theological account of who built the mounds. The relationship between the Book of Mormon narrative and the actual archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America is a subject of ongoing discussion among both Mormon scholars and archaeologists. This is not a dismissal of religious tradition. Religious traditions have their own domain, and the claims of faith do not stand or fall on the same evidentiary standards as archaeological claims. But it is an acknowledgement that the question of who built the earthworks has been embedded in religious and cultural narratives that shape the public understanding in ways that go beyond the purely archaeological. The point is that the question of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not just an academic question. It is embedded in social and political and religious narratives that have shaped the way the evidence has been presented and interpreted and what has been allowed to count as an acceptable answer. Those narratives are not going away, but they are being complicated and challenged by the evidence, which continues to accumulate in the direction of a more complex and more honest picture. The picture that is emerging is one in which the indigenous peoples of North America were not the passive recipients of a history that happened to them, but the active architects of a civilization that shaped the continent they inhabited. Not a perfect civilization, not an idealized one, but a real one with the full range of human qualities and capacities and contradictions that real civilizations have. They built things that were impressive by any standard. They knew things that were sophisticated by any measure. They organized themselves in ways that achieved remarkable results over remarkable time periods. And they did all of this on a continent that was not, as the myth of the empty land requires, a blank slate waiting for civilization to be imposed on it from outside. It was a working civilization developing on its own terms, achieving on its own terms, and deserving of recognition on its own terms. That recognition has been denied for too long. The evidence for the civilization has been available for 2 centuries. The archaeological investigations have been conducted. The genetic analyses have been performed. The oral traditions have been recorded. The land management knowledge has been documented. All of the ingredients for a comprehensive and honest account of pre-Columbian North American civilization have been available in increasing completeness for a very long time. What has been missing is not the evidence. What has been missing is the will to engage with it honestly and the framework within which that honest engagement is possible. That framework is changing. The will is growing. The engagement is happening. Let's keep going. Let us keep following the evidence where it leads, with the honesty and the humility and the genuine curiosity that the evidence deserves. Because there is more to tell. There always is. The Great Serpent Mound is not the only effigy mound in North America. The Midwest is home to dozens of them. Animals rendered in earth at a scale that can only be fully appreciated from above. In the tradition that flourished particularly in Wisconsin and Iowa during the late woodland period between roughly 700 and 1000 CE, panthers and bears and birds and water spirits and human figures rendered in earth, sometimes in groups that seem to tell a story that we can only partially read. These effigy mounds are not primarily burial mounds. Many of them contain no human remains or only token deposits at specific locations. They were built for reasons that the archaeology alone cannot fully explain, and the oral traditions that might explain them are in many cases not sufficiently documented, or held within communities that have not chosen to make them fully public. This is an important point that sometimes gets lost in the general account. Not everything about pre-Columbian North American civilization is accessible to outside investigation. Some of the knowledge is held in communities that have maintained it precisely because they did not share it with the people who were destroying everything else. And those communities have every right to decide what to share and what to keep. The effigy mounds may carry cosmological meanings that are still known within the communities whose ancestors built them. Those meanings are not owed to outside investigators, not available on demand to any archaeologist who shows up with a research agenda. They belong to the communities that hold them. This is a complication for the project of understanding pre-Columbian North American civilization, and it is a complication that honest engagement with the project requires acknowledging. The full story is not fully accessible from outside. Parts of it are held within living traditions that have the right to maintain appropriate boundaries around what they share and with whom and how. What that means for the public account is that the public account will always be incomplete, not just because of the limitations of archaeological evidence or the losses of the historical catastrophe, but because some of the knowledge is alive and held carefully and will be shared on terms set by the communities that hold it, not on terms set by outside investigators. That is not a failure of the archaeological project. It is a feature of the situation, a reflection of the fact that the civilization we're trying to understand is not dead. Its people are alive. Its traditions persist. Its knowledge, fragmented and transformed but real, continues to be held and practiced and transmitted by communities that have a stake in it that goes beyond academic interest. The relationship between archaeological investigation and indigenous community knowledge is one of the most important and one of the most difficult aspects of the ongoing recovery of the pre-Columbian North American past. Getting that relationship right requires the archaeological community to approach indigenous knowledge with genuine respect and genuine openness, recognizing that it is a source of genuine historical and scientific information and not merely a cultural curiosity or a political complication. And it requires indigenous communities to find their own ways of engaging with the archaeological investigation of their heritage on terms that respect their sovereignty over that heritage. That negotiation is ongoing. It is sometimes contentious. It is always important. And it is producing results in the form of collaborative research projects and jointly managed sites and integrated accounts of pre-Columbian history that draw on both archaeological evidence and oral tradition in ways that are richer and more complete than either alone could produce. The future of the recovery of pre-Columbian North American civilization lies in that collaboration, not in the isolated work of archaeologists working on sites they do not fully understand without the benefit of the knowledge that the descendant communities hold, not in the isolated assertion of traditional knowledge without the benefit of the specific, verifiable material evidence that archaeology can provide. In the combination, the genuine and respectful collaboration that brings both forms of knowledge to bear on questions that neither can fully answer alone. That collaboration is the hope, and the evidence suggests it is beginning to be realized. Now let us come to the end, or the beginning of the end, or what passes for an ending in a story that is not over, because this story is not over. The evidence continues to accumulate. The understanding continues to deepen. The people who carry the living traditions continue to assert their knowledge and their connection to the heritage that the earthworks represent. And the earthworks themselves continue to stand, or the ones that have not been destroyed continue to stand, marking the landscape with their massive presence, encoding in their forms and their alignments and their spatial relationships the accumulated knowledge and the cosmological beliefs and the organizational achievements of the people who built them. They have been standing for a very long time. Monk's Mound for 1,000 years. The Newark earthworks for 2,000. The Watson Break mounds for 5,000. They have outlasted the specific cultures that built them. They have outlasted the various myths that were constructed to explain them. They are outlasting the minimization and the denial that characterize so much of the public account. They will still be there when the current moment of recognition has passed and been absorbed into the general understanding and then become the taken-for-granted background against which new questions are asked. That is what monuments do. They outlast the specific conversations of the moment and anchor the longer conversation of civilization with itself about what matters and what lasts and what deserves to be remembered. The earthworks of pre-Columbian North America are that kind of monument. They are worth paying attention to. They are worth the effort of understanding. They are worth the revision of the comfortable story that their evidence demands. The civilization that built them was here. It was remarkable. It is part of the full account of what humanity has achieved and what humanity has lost and what humanity is still learning to understand about itself. That is the story. Not complete, never complete, but closer to true than what came before. Let's hold on to it. Let's carry it forward. Let's keep asking the questions it raises and following the evidence where it leads. Because the questions it raises are among the most important questions that can be asked about who we are and where we came from and what we owe to the human past. All of the human past, the full, extraordinary complexity of it, not just the parts that are convenient to acknowledge. The civilization was here. It built remarkable things. It knew remarkable things. It was lost largely in a catastrophe we are still reckoning with. And what survived of it is still here in the earthworks and in the soil and in the astronomical alignments and in the oral traditions and in the living communities of indigenous peoples who were the inheritors of everything that did not perish. That inheritance is real. That connection is real. That civilization is real. And the story of it is only beginning to be honestly told. Rest in that for a moment. Let the scale of it settle. 5,000 years of organized cultural life. Astronomical knowledge precise enough to encode the 18.5-year lunar cycle in earthwork geometry. Trade networks spanning a continent. Agricultural practices sophisticated enough to maintain productive landscapes for centuries. Medical knowledge specific enough to identify the compounds we now call aspirin and use them effectively. Ecological knowledge detailed enough to manage forests and grasslands and water systems in ways that maintain their productivity across generations. And then the catastrophe, the 90% collapse, the loss of the specialists and the institutional structures that maintain the knowledge, the suppression of the practices and the traditions that survive the demographic collapse, the construction over the ruins of a narrative that said there had been nothing here worth noting. That narrative is failing. The evidence is too consistent, too detailed, too large to be contained within it any longer. The story that the evidence tells is getting out, reaching the people who need to hear it, changing the understanding that shapes the decisions that matter. This is one small part of that process. One telling in the dark to whoever is listening. If you're listening, thank you. If you have stayed with this story through all the complexity and all the detail and all the places where it gets uncomfortable or difficult, then you understand something about the pre-Columbian North American past that most people do not yet understand. That understanding matters. It changes things subtly but really to know what was here, to understand the scale of the achievement and the scale of the loss, to recognize in the earthworks not the work of a lost race or the products of ancient aliens, but the expression of human ingenuity and human organization and human aspiration operating over thousands of years in specific places with specific knowledge and specific beliefs about what mattered. They mattered. Their civilization mattered. Their knowledge mattered. And their story, the full, honest version of it, matters to the ongoing project of understanding what human beings have been and can be and should aspire to be. Keep listening. Keep asking. Keep following the evidence. The story is not over. It is barely beginning to be told. And now, as the weight of all of this begins to settle, as the images of earthworks and copper and lunar alignments and abandoned cities begin to soften at the edges, I want to spend the last of this time not on more facts or more analysis, but on something simpler, on the feeling of standing at the base of Monk's Mound on a quiet evening in autumn, when the light is coming from the west and the long shadows stretch across the floodplain, and the air carries the smell of the river and knowing. what you're standing at the base of. Not just an interesting archaeological feature. 100 feet of human intention shaped from the earth by millions of individual acts of labor organized across generations by a civilization that understood itself to be part of something larger than any individual life. On the feeling of looking at the Newark earthworks from above, from the aerial photographs that make their geometry visible in a way that it is not visible from the ground, and seeing for the first time the perfection of those circles and octagons, the impossible precision of their alignment, the scale of the thing that was built here in a landscape that had no stone and no metal and no wheel, but had instead human beings who knew what they were doing and had organized themselves to do it. On the feeling of reading an account of the De Soto expedition moving through the American Southeast in the 1540s, describing dense populations and large towns and organized political structures, and then reading the accounts of English colonists arriving in the same region a century later and finding much of it gone, emptied by the epidemics that had preceded the colonists by decades, and feeling the weight of that loss. On the feeling of reading an oral tradition recorded by an ethnographer in the early 20th century, in which an elder describes the mounds of his people's ancestors with a knowledge and a reverence that makes clear the connection between the present community and the ancient constructions. A connection that the mound builder myth denied for 2 centuries and that the honest archaeology confirms. These feelings are not evidence. They are responses to evidence, the emotional dimension of the intellectual encounter with a reality more complex and more significant than expected. But they matter. They are part of what it means to take the history seriously, to let it be real rather than keeping it at the safe distance of academic abstraction. The people who built these things were real. Their lives were real. Their knowledge was real. Their achievement was real. And the catastrophe that ended the specific forms of that achievement and reduced the populations that carried it was real and as devastating as any catastrophe in human history. Letting that reality be real, letting it land with the weight it actually has, is part of what honest engagement with the history requires. The earthworks are there. They have been there for a long time, and they will be there, or most of them will, for a long time to come. They are patient in the way that physical monuments are patient. They do not need our recognition to exist, but our recognition changes what they are for us, makes them available as the kind of evidence and the kind of inspiration that they actually are, rather than the kind of curiosity or embarrassment that they have been treated as for too long. The civilization was here. It is worth knowing. It is worth telling. Tonight, lie in the dark, wherever you are in the world, you know a little more of it than you did before. That is not nothing. That is, in the only way that matters, a continuation of the tradition of telling that has kept human knowledge alive across all the catastrophes and all the silences and all the distances that separate the present from the past. The tradition continues. The story is still being told. The earthworks still stand. Rest now. Dream of those ancient alignments between earth and stars. Dream of copper moving across a continent in the hands of people who knew what it meant and where it was going. Dream of cities rising from the Mississippi floodplain when European civilization was still, in some respects, finding its feet. The world that was here was remarkable. And the world that is here, the one that exists in the spaces where honest engagement with that past is happening, is beginning slowly to know it. Good night, and thank you for listening. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.